Close your eyes. Let the weight of the day slide off your shoulders, just like a heavy coat falling to the floor. Imagine for a moment that you have travelled back in time, not to a grand palace, not to a battlefield, but to a simple quiet room in the mid-1700s. The air here is different. It smells of wood smoke, of dried lavender, of damp earth, and of the faint underlying scent of humanity living close to the bone. You are not a spectator in a history book. You are simply here. In this world there is no tap to turn for instant warmth. There is no concept of a shower, no germ theory to explain why we wash our hands, and yet the people around you, the farmer, the shopkeeper, the woman mending linen by the hearth, are consumed by the idea of cleanliness. It is an obsession, a labour, a daily ritual that defines their very existence, but it is not the cleanliness we know. We often think of the 18th century as a time of filth and neglect, a time when people simply accepted the grime. But that is the sanitized version of history. The truth is far more intimate, far more human, and infinitely more fascinating. Tonight we are going to peel back the layers of linen and custom to see how ordinary people actually managed their bodies before the modern world existed. We are going to step into their homes, their barbershops, and their quietest moments of self-care. You might wonder why I'm sharing this with you, because there is a profound, quiet beauty in the way our ancestors cared for themselves with nothing more than their own two hands, a bucket of water, and a stubborn belief in order. Whether you're lying in bed, watching the shadows dance on the wall, or simply finding a moment of silence, let this story be your companion. Let the history breathe. The channel Sleepy History with Benedict is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of positive emotional values. To understand the 18th century body, we must first abandon what we know about health. Today, we view water as the great purifier. But for a person living in 1750, water, especially when applied to the entire surface of the skin, was often viewed with deep, professional suspicion. Imagine a physician of the time adjusting his wig, looking at a patient with grave concern, and advising them to avoid the tub. It sounds like madness to our modern ears, but to them it was the height of medical wisdom. The prevailing belief was built upon the delicate balance of the body's humours. It was thought that the skin was not merely a protective barrier, but a porous membrane, a drainage system for the body's inner corruptions. If you were to soak in a bath, you risked opening those pores too wide. A warm bath, they feared, would soften the body, making it susceptible to the miasmas, the foul invisible airs that were believed to carry disease. You were essentially inviting the sickness to crawl inside you through the very pores that were trying to protect you. Even more alarming to the 18th century mind was the idea that water could trap these internal corruptions. If you washed too thoroughly, you were seen as sealing off the body's primary exit routes. You were trapping the internal waste inside, forcing it back into the blood, into the organs, into the delicate mechanism of the soul. So what did they do instead? They did not stop cleaning, they simply redirected their efforts. The strategy was centered on the linen, the white woven fabric that sat closest to the skin. The shirt, the shift, the chemise, these were not just clothing, they were the body's primary hygiene filter. The belief was that the linen would wick away the impurities from the skin, absorbing the sweat, the oils, and the dirt. To change one's linen was to perform a cleansing act. A clean white shirt was the 18th century equivalent of a bath. Picture the laundress, a figure central to this entire ecosystem. She understood what the doctors often obscured, that cleanliness was not about avoiding water, but about managing the labour of cleaning. She knew the texture of the fabric, the specific, gruelling physical effort required to lift the grime of a week of life out of the fibres. She was not just a worker, she was the gatekeeper of social and bodily health. As you listen, try to imagine the rhythm of her work, the splash of the bucket, the scrub on the board, the endless cycle of the wash. It was a rhythm that kept the world moving, one clean shirt at a time. If the linen was the shield, then the ritual of the laundry was the holy war against decay. We must talk about the white shirt, the chemise, the shift. These garments were the most intimate companions of the 18th century body. They were rarely made of cotton, which was expensive and imported. They were almost exclusively linen, a fibre derived from the flax plant, sturdy, absorbent, and capable of being boiled, beaten and sun-bleached without falling apart. To possess enough linen was a mark of respectability, but to manage that linen was a life-consuming task. Imagine the domestic scene. It is a Tuesday or a Wednesday, designated as wash day. The sheer scale of the labour is hard for us to fathom today. The linens heavily soiled from days of hard work, from the smoke of coal fires, from the dust of unpaved streets, had to be soaked, rubbed with potash-based soap, boiled in massive copper cauldrons, and then rinsed repeatedly in cold, clear water. The boiling was the most critical step. Even without knowing the microscopic truth of bacteria, people understood that heat had the power to transform. A piece of fabric that was grey and heavy with use, once boiled and hung out to dry in the brilliant bleaching sunlight, emerged transformed, stiff, white, and smelling of the open air. This process of solar bleaching was not just a chore, it was a form of alchemy. The sunlight, combined with the clean, fresh air, was believed to purify the cloth in a way that stagnant water never could. But consider the physical toll on the women who performed this. Their hands were constantly red, chapped and raw, hardened by the lye in the soap and the friction of the washboard. They were the invisible engines of 18th century hygiene. When you see a person of that time wearing a crisp white neckcloth or a stiffened collar, you are seeing the result of hours of grueling, back-breaking labour. It was a cycle of constant maintenance. You wore the linen until it was soiled, you washed it, you dried it, you pressed it, and then the cycle began again. It was a rhythm of life that connected every household from the wealthiest manor to the modest cottage. And in this rhythm there was a kind of quiet dignity. The person who kept their linen clean was a person who maintained their place in the world, who showed their neighbours that they cared for their health, their home, and their own body. It was a silent language, spoken in the whiteness of a hanging sheet, fluttering in the breeze on a quiet afternoon. Step out from the laundry-filled courtyard and onto the bustling, narrow street. You hear the rhythmic scraping of steel against leather, the sound of the 18th century barber shop. In our modern imagination, a barber is simply someone who trims hair. But to walk into a barber shop in the 1700s was to enter a hub of medicine, gossip, and essential bodily maintenance. This was a sanctuary of the masculine world here. The barber was not just a stylist, he was a barber-surgeon. His repertoire extended far beyond the razor. If you had a tooth aching with an unrelenting throbbing pressure, you did not go to a dentist because dentists as a formal profession hardly existed. You went to the barber. He would take his specialized pliers, and with a swiftness born of long practice, he would remove the source of your agony. He also performed minor surgeries, dressed wounds and applied salves. The barber's basin, often made of brass or tin, was a constant fixture, a vessel for the blood and the water that marked his dual identity as a groomer and a healer. But beyond the medical tasks, the barbershop was a social equalizer. It was a space where the news of the town was exchanged, where reputations were built or ruined over the hiss of hot water and the sharpness of the steel. The smell here was distinctive, a mixture of bay rum, sweet pomade, soap, and the metallic tang of blood and iron for the gentleman of the day. A visit here was not a luxury, it was a necessary part of presenting oneself to the world. And then there were the wigs, the periwig. That icon of 18th century fashion was the ultimate layer of hygiene, or perhaps the ultimate challenge to it. As we look at the powdered curls, we must remember that beneath the elaborate structure, the head was rarely washed with water. Instead, the scalp was rubbed with pomades and perfumes, and the hair beneath was kept cropped short to fit. It was a strange, sensory-heavy way of life. The powder, made of starch and scented with lavender or orris root, acted as a dry shampoo, absorbing the oils of the scalp and masking the scent of the head. It was, in its own way, a sophisticated solution to a problem they couldn't solve with a bathtub. As you sit in the barber's chair, feeling the warm cloth on your face, you realize how much work went into the simple act of looking decent. It was an art, a craft, and a shared ritual that brought people together in the small, crowded rooms of the city long before the sun had even fully risen on the day. All stories on this channel, Sleepy History with Benedict, are fictional, thoughtfully crafted around historical themes and inspired by real events, figures, and periods, reimagined for engaging storytelling. The content does not represent real individuals, actual events, or documented cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is purely coincidental. The air in the 18th century street was thick with competing scents. It was a complex, layered atmosphere, some of it earthy, some of it sharp, and some of it intentionally masked by the most exquisite fragrances. In a time before modern medicine could explain the microscopic world, people navigated their environment by their sense of smell. To them, a bad smell was not just unpleasant, it was a danger sign. A foul odor was the physical manifestation of miasma, that invisible toxic vapor believed to carry disease from decaying matter directly into the lungs and blood. This is why perfume was not considered a mere luxury or an indulgence of the vanity. It was a necessity of survival. To carry a scent was to carry a shield. When you walked through the crowded, narrow streets of London or Paris, you were not just choosing a fragrance for the sake of beauty. You were choosing an armour of lavender, rose, or citrus to ward off the encroaching rot. Perfumeries became the apothecaries of the social world. They mixed volatile oils and spirits, not just to delight the senses, but to purify the personal atmosphere. If you are enjoying this journey through the hidden corners of the 1700s, I would truly appreciate it if you could take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It takes only a few seconds, but it helps this story reach more listeners who, like you, find peace in the quiet details of our shared human history. I would also love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, if you could visit an 18th century shop, which one would you choose to step inside first? The bustling barber shop, or the fragrant, quiet world of the perfumery? Your support and your presence here mean more than you know. Think of the delicate glass bottles kept on the vanity of an 18th century home. These were not just containers, they were instruments of care. They were used to dab the pulse points, to freshen the linen, to clear the air of a sick room. The sophistication of these scents, blending base notes of musk with top notes of bergamot or orange flower, shows us a society that was deeply attuned to the nuances of their physical world. They knew that when you could not wash away the world with water, you could at least transform your relationship with it through the power of scent. As the evening quiet deepens around you, imagine the scent of dried orange peel and clove lingering in a room. It was a way of claiming space, of creating a sanctuary of health in a world that felt constantly under siege by the elements. It was an act of hope, a gentle refusal to be overwhelmed by the grime, and a testament to the fact that even in the most challenging times, humans have always sought to surround themselves with something sweet, something clean, and something beautiful. While the cities had their apothecaries and perfumers, the colonial farmhouse operated on a different philosophy. Nothing was wasted. The rhythm of hygiene in the rural 18th century was dictated by the harvest, the slaughter, and the fire. To be clean here was to be a chemist in your own kitchen, creating soap from the most basic, often unappealing remnants of life. Consider the soap-making day, a labour-intensive event that required patience, fire, and a keen eye. The base was lye, a highly caustic substance leached from hardwood ashes. This was mixed with the fats gathered throughout the year, rendered tallow from beef or mutton, or the drippings from the kitchen hearth. It was a careful, even dangerous process. If the lye was too strong, it would burn the skin. If too weak, the soap would be soft and ineffective. The woman at the kettle had to watch the boiling mass, testing it by touch and smell, relying on a lifetime of intuitive knowledge. When they ran out of soap, the consequences were not merely aesthetic. They were profound. The laundry would stack up, the linens would grey, and the very concept of decent living would begin to fray at the edges. This is why you would see barrels of ash being saved throughout the winter, and why the fat trimmings were so carefully guarded. It was a domestic survival mechanism. There is a quiet stoic beauty in this. It speaks of a time when the gap between having and needing was filled by human labour. You did not simply go to a store to purchase a plastic bottle of cleanser. You stood by the fire, you stirred the pot, you watched the chemical transformation take place in the bubbling grey-white mixture. You were responsible for your own purity. Even the scent of this homemade soap was different, clean, sharp, and smelling of wood smoke and rendered fat. It was the scent of a household that had successfully fought back the dirt for another season. As you settle deeper into your rest, try to imagine that heat, the heavy, humid air of the kitchen, the steady, rhythmic motion of the wooden paddle against the side of the iron kettle. It is a slow, grounding image, a reminder of the raw physical effort that allowed our ancestors to keep their world in balance, stitch by stitch, bar by bar, day by day. It was a life lived in direct contact with the materials of the world, never detached, never automated, always profoundly present. We must now turn our gaze to the darker, more hidden side of the city, the part of life that was rarely spoken of in polite company, yet was essential for the survival of every urban dweller. Imagine the streets of London or Paris in the middle of the night. The city is quiet, the oil lamps have flickered out, and the air is cool. This is when the night soil men moved. They were the invisible workers of the 18th century, the custodians of the city's deepest, most persistent problem, human waste. In a world before sewer systems, the chamber pot was the primary tool of daily life. It sat beneath every bed, in every room, a simple ceramic or tin vessel that held the reality of human biology. But where did it all go? In the morning, the contents were often emptied into cesspits, deep, dug-out holes beneath the foundations of houses or in the backyards. Over time, these pits would fill, becoming a source of intense, overwhelming smell and a constant fear of contamination for the wells nearby. This was why the night soil men were so essential. They arrived in the pre-dawn hours with their heavy carts and their long-handled shovels. They would break into the cesspits, manually removing the compacted waste to be hauled away to the countryside, where it was often repurposed as fertilizer for the fields. It was a trade that required a stomach of iron and a complete lack of pretense. They moved in the shadows, doing the work that made the daylight life of the city possible. Consider the complexity of this urban management. The density of the population meant that every single person was part of a chain of waste and reclamation. You had the householder, the person who kept the pot, the person who emptied it, and the person who hauled it away. Everyone had a role in this silent, smelly, and absolutely critical cycle. It was a reminder that even in the most refined eras, beneath the silks and the powdered wigs, the human body remained a biological engine that could never be ignored. As you listen to the silence of your own room, contrast it with the muffled sounds of those old city streets, the creak of wheels on cobblestones, the soft thud of shovels, the low voices of men working in the dark. It was a world that had to be incredibly pragmatic to survive. They did not have the luxury of out-of-sight, out-of-mind infrastructure. They lived with the evidence of their own existence, day after day. It was a raw, unfiltered reality, one that highlights just how much effort, physical, logistical, and social, it took to simply keep a city functioning. While the poor and the middling sort struggled with the logistics of waste and wash day, the wealthy were fighting a different battle, the battle against the passage of time. They too were obsessed with the face, but their solutions were far more dangerous. If you were a person of status in the 1700s, you desired a complexion as white as porcelain, a symbol of a life that did not need to labour in the sun. To achieve this, beauty was not just an art, it was a lethal chemistry. Women and men alike painted their faces with ceruse, a concoction made of white lead and vinegar. It smoothed the skin, certainly, and it provided that coveted deathly pale aesthetic, but beneath the surface the lead was slowly poisoning them. It caused skin tremors, hair loss, and long-term neurological decay. They would add splashes of vermilion derived from mercury to highlight their cheeks. It is a haunting thought. The very things they used to signify beauty and vitality were, in fact, silently diminishing their health. And yet, as the century progressed, a new, more natural remedy began to gain favour among the elite: the sea. Sea bathing became the prescribed cure for almost every ailment. Doctors would send wealthy patients to the coast, instructing them to submerge themselves in the frigid, turbulent Atlantic or the English Channel. It was thought that the salt, the cold, and the very act of immersion could shock the body back into harmony. Before we continue deeper into this strange world, I want to invite you to connect with the community here. If this story has helped you settle into a quieter state of mind, please consider hitting the subscribe button and leaving a comment. Tell me, what is one historical mystery or daily ritual you would love for us to explore in a future story? Your input helps shape the paths we walk together. And if you've found even a moment of peace, a simple like goes a long way in letting me know that these stories are finding their home with you. Imagine the wealthy aristocrat shivering in the grey light of a coastal morning, wrapped in a heavy bathing gown, stepping into the waves. It was a stark contrast to the stifling, perfume-heavy salons of the city. For a few minutes, they were stripped of their powders, their lead, and their social masks. They were just cold, shivering human beings in the vast, indifferent ocean. It was a fleeting, desperate attempt to reclaim a health that their lifestyle had slowly stripped away. It was an irony that did not escape even them, the search for purity in the wild, salty depths of the sea. While the elite were poisoning themselves with lead, there was another side to 18th century skincare, one that was quiet, grounded, and deeply tied to the natural world. In the apothecary's shop and the domestic kitchen, there was a hidden sophistication that modern science is only now beginning to validate. Long before skincare was a multi-billion-dollar industry, it was a garden-based craft. Think of the rosewater infusions, the elderflower distillations, and the thick, soothing salves made from calendula and comfrey. Apothecaries and village healers spent years mastering the extraction of essential oils and the infusion of plants into fats and waxes. They knew through centuries of trial and error that honey was a humectant, that lavender possessed antiseptic properties, and that certain clays could draw impurities from the pores. This was not fringe science, it was the foundation of medicine. Every household had its collection of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. The smell of a well-stocked pantry in the 1700s was a complex mixture of drying herbs, the sharp sting of mint, the woody depth of rosemary, and the sweet, almost intoxicating aroma of chamomile. When a person's skin became chafed from the cold or irritated by the harsh lye soaps, they didn't reach for a chemical moisturizer, they reached for these infusions. There is a profound connection here to our own time. Look at the labels of the most expensive natural skincare products today, and you will see the same ingredients that the 18th century woman used: chamomile to soothe, honey to hydrate, rosehip to rejuvenate. We have spent 2 centuries trying to replace these botanical wonders with synthetic compounds, only to find ourselves circling back, realizing that the knowledge they held in their herb gardens was not a primitive fantasy, it was effective chemistry. Imagine the quiet focus of an 18th century woman preparing a batch of chamomile cream. She knows the plant's cycle. She picked it at the right hour of the morning when the oils were at their peak. She isn't doing this to be trendy. She is doing it because her skin needs care, and this is the only way to provide it. It is an act of deep, quiet observation. As you drift towards sleep, picture those gentle rhythmic movements, the grinding of herbs in a stone mortar, the slow melting of wax, the careful application of a cool herbal salve. It is a reminder that nature has always provided the answers, provided we have the patience to listen and the hands to do the work. We have wandered through the perfumeries and the gardens, but we must also acknowledge the stubborn, uncomfortable realities that no amount of scent could truly hide. Consider dental care, or rather the lack of it. Before the era of the toothbrush as we know it, Dental health was a matter of grit and endurance. People used rough cloths, salt or charred bark to scour their teeth, hoping to stave off the decay that was for so many an inevitable companion of age. It is a humbling thought. The simple rhythmic act of brushing our teeth each night is a luxury that would have been a miracle to someone living in 1740. And then there were the lice. We often like to imagine that cleanliness was a barrier that kept the world at bay, but the truth is that lice were a near universal feature of life. From the crowded attics of the city to the silk-lined beds of the aristocracy, the parasite was a persistent, uninvited guest. They lived in the seams of clothes, in the roots of hair, in the folds of bedding. To be clean did not mean you were free of them, it simply meant you managed them. You combed, you picked, you washed your linens in boiling water. It was a constant, exhausting, and rarely won battle of attrition. But in the midst of this struggle, there were the unsung heroes of the era, the laundresses, the milliners, the weavers, and the invisible labourers who kept the fabric of society intact. These people were the true guardians of the public appearance. They took the raw materials of life, the dirt, the grime, the wear and tear, and worked them into a state of presentable order. If you're finding this deep dive into the ordinary lives of the past to be a calming end to your day, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment below. It is your engagement that allows us to keep exploring these quiet human histories, and I'm genuinely curious to know what part of this story has surprised you the most. Is it the persistence of the lice, the labour of the laundry, or the surprising sophistication of the herbal remedies? Your thoughts are the heart of this community, and if you have a moment alike, helps other seekers of history find this quiet space amidst the noise of the internet. Think of the laundress again, her back aching as she hangs the heavy wet sheets on the line. She is not thinking of history, she is thinking of the work of the sunset, of the relief that comes with a task completed. Her life was defined by this physical, tangible relationship with the world. She was the one who kept the linens white, the one who fought the grime, the one who, in her own quiet, unrecorded way, allowed the world to continue, one clean shirt at a time. It is a perspective worth holding on to as the day fades. The dignity of the small, the importance of the routine, and the sheer remarkable effort of simply living. As we reach the later stages of our journey, we must confront one of the most persistent myths of the 18th century. The idea that a lack of cleanliness was a reflection of a person's character. We look back through the centuries and sometimes judge the poor for their grime, their frayed clothes, and their weary appearance. But we must be clear, the ability to be clean was, and often still is, a matter of resources. In the 1700s, to be truly clean required water, fuel, soap, time, and privacy, all of which were luxury goods for the labouring classes. If you lived in a crowded room with 10 other people, if you spent 14 hours a day in a factory or a field, if you lacked the means to boil your water or the space to dry your linens, then dirt was not a choice, it was an environmental consequence. The person who could not keep their collar white was not lacking in moral fibre, they were lacking in the infrastructure that the wealthy took for granted. This distinction is important because it changes how we see the past. When we see the dirt of the 18th century, we are not looking at a lack of effort. We are looking at the visible evidence of inequality. The wealthy, with their scented handkerchiefs and their laundered wigs, were living off the labour of those who had no time to scrub their own lives clean. The apothecary and the laundress were performing the maintenance that kept the city's elites looking pristine, often while living in conditions that made their own hygiene nearly impossible to maintain. There is a profound, quiet injustice in this history, but also a profound, quiet strength. Despite these systemic barriers, the poorest people in the 1700s still found ways to maintain their dignity. They washed their faces in the cool morning dew, they mended their clothes by the dim light of a single candle, they helped their neighbours in times of illness. They were not defined by their dirt, but by their endurance. As the night deepens, let this thought settle in. Care is older than knowledge, and it is older than status. Long before we had the germ theory to explain why we wash, we had the instinct to care for our bodies and the bodies of those we loved. This instinct was the true anchor of human history, the quiet, persistent pulse that kept our ancestors going, regardless of how much soap or water they had at their disposal. It is a story of human dignity against the odds, a story that belongs to all of us. This content is inspired by and adapted from public domain works available through Project Gutenberg. The material has been transformed through original narration, editing and storytelling to create a unique experience for educational and entertainment purposes. As we approach the end of our wandering, let us sit for a moment with the idea of the invisible work. Tonight we have travelled through the 18th century, witnessing the red, raw hands of the laundress, the steady, rhythmic precision of the barber, and the quiet alchemy of the apothecary. These were not just tasks, they were the daily, repetitive, often exhausting efforts that kept the human species in the world. There is something deeply moving about this. When we think of history, we often focus on the grand events, the treaties, the battles, the rise and fall of crowns. But the real history, the one that lives in the bones of our ancestors, is found in these smaller things. It is in the hauling of a bucket of water from a well, the mending of a tear in a linen shirt, the grinding of tooth powder in a small mortar-filled room. It is the history of the body maintained through centuries of trial, error, and an enduring stubborn hope. Consider your own daily routine, the way you stand under the warm spray of the shower, the way you brush your teeth, the way you choose your clothes. These are actions so automatic that we have almost forgotten they are choices, choices that our ancestors would have found miraculous. They were once the subjects of intense debate, the products of medical theories now discarded, and the result of physical labour that defined a person's entire week. We stand at the end of a long, long road of learning, and we carry with us the legacy of those who failed, those who learned, and those who simply kept going. You are not so different from them. Whether you are living in 1743 or 2026, you are still a person in a body, navigating a world that demands your attention, your care, and your maintenance. You are still looking for ways to stay healthy, to find comfort, and to manage the delicate gap between what your body is and what it needs to be. That struggle is universal. It is the story of every generation. The lavender that the 18th century woman hung to dry in her kitchen window, the soap that was boiled in the iron kettle, the clean linen that was bleached by the summer sun, all of this was an expression of care. It was a language of love and survival that didn't need words. And tonight, as you close your eyes, you are participating in that same ancient story. You are the latest in a long line of people who have learned, failed, struggled, and eventually found their way to rest. Let the history breathe around you. Let the faces of the past fade into the shadows of your room. You have done the work of the day, the body has been tended, the maintenance is complete, and the quiet has arrived. Everything else can wait. There is a particular kind of silence that falls when we stop focusing on the mechanics of our lives and simply exist within the moment. Throughout our journey tonight, we have looked at the grit, the soap, the lead, and the lavender, the raw components of an 18th century existence. But as the shadows in your room stretch and deepen, what remains is not the dirt or the labour, but the feeling of continuity. Think of the person living in 1760, finishing their day just as you are finishing yours. They might have been exhausted, their hands might have been aching from the washboard or the cold, yet there was a rhythm to their exhaustion that was uniquely human. They understood that the body was a vessel that required constant, careful tending. They felt the same relief you feel when the fire dies down to embers, when the work is finally set aside, and when the heavy, welcoming curtains of sleep begin to pull closed. We are not separated from them by a wall of time. We are connected by a thread of shared experience. Every time you find yourself tidying your space, every time you take a moment to care for yourself after a long, demanding day, you are echoing an ancient ritual. You are continuing a story that began long before the industrial age, long before our modern conveniences, and long before we understood the microscopic reasons why we keep ourselves clean. It is a beautiful thought, isn't it, that for hundreds of years humans have been trying to get it right. They got so many theories wrong. They believed in the wrong humours. They used the wrong minerals. They feared the water that could have saved them. But the trying was never wrong. The care was real. The intention to protect, to sanitize, to make one's surroundings a place of order and peace. That was a triumph of the human spirit. Tonight, let yourself let go of that burden of getting it right. You have learned something of how they struggled, how they innovated, and how they lived. You have walked through their homes and touched the rough, honest history of their lives. Now, there is nothing left to do. The water has been hauled. The linens have been bleached. The apothecary's shop is closed, and the streets are quiet. The history is resting, and you are resting with it. Allow the weight of the centuries to slip away, leaving you in the soft, uncomplicated darkness of the present. You are safe here. You are present, and that is enough. As we move deeper into the quietude, consider for a moment the sheer scale of the trial and error that brought us to this night. The path from the crude lye ash soap of the colonial farmhouse to the refined, gentle rituals of today was not a straight line. It was a winding, often confusing journey filled with both brilliance and deep misunderstanding. We often view the past as a collection of mistakes, but that is a narrow way to look at the persistence of life. Every failed medical theory, every misguided beauty prescription, every struggle against an invisible louse. These were not just errors, they were attempts to master the environment, to impose a little bit of order on a world that often felt chaotic. The people of the 1700s were, in their own way, scientists of the everyday. They observed, they adapted, and they passed their hard-won knowledge down to the next generation, one generation building upon the fragile, imperfect foundations of the last. Consider the grandmother who taught her daughter how to tell when the soap was ready by the sound it made in the iron kettle. Consider the barber who, through thousands of shaves, learned exactly how to move his razor to avoid the smallest nick. This was a form of knowledge that didn't live in books. It lived in the muscles, in the hands, and in the lived experience of the day-to-day. Even today, we rely on a kind of inherited intuition. We wash our hands because we feel we should. We create routines that bring us comfort, and we seek out scents and textures that make our personal space feel like a sanctuary. Much of this is built on the foundation of those who went before us, those who, despite their ignorance of germs and their limited tools, never stopped trying to keep themselves and their loved ones protected. It is a humbling realization. The comfort you feel in your own home, the ease with which you maintain your health, is not just a modern invention, it is the culmination of centuries of effort. As you listen to the stillness of your room, let yourself feel a small, quiet sense of gratitude for those who came before. They might have been wrong about the science, but they were remarkably right about the intent. They cared, they worked, they tried. And in that, they are not so different from you. You are part of the same long, unbroken chain of life, simply doing what humans have always done, finding ways to stay, finding ways to care, and finding ways to rest. As we drift toward the final stretches of our time together tonight, let us contemplate the simple, profound fact of the human body in the 18th century. It was a body that was constantly touching, constantly working, and constantly connected to the physical matter of its world. Whether it was the woman pulling water from a deep stone-lined well, or the man sitting in the barber's chair feeling the steady, practiced hand of the craftsman on his face, the sense of touch was the primary way of knowing the world. There was a tactile honesty to their lives that we have largely lost. We exist in a world of touchscreens, of remote controls, of digital interfaces that keep us at a distance from the processes of our own survival. But back then, to be clean was to feel the grit of the soap, the heat of the fire, the coldness of the rinse water. It was a sensory experience that reminded them, every single day, of the boundary between themselves and the world they were trying to navigate. Perhaps that is why we find such peace in these stories. We are hungry for that directness. We are tired of the abstractions, the invisible systems, and the distant infrastructures. We want to know what it felt like to actually reach out and change one's environment. We want to understand the effort, the physical reality, the sweat and the struggle that went into creating a life that was healthy and decent. It brings us back to that one essential truth. Care is not a system, and it is not a set of rules. It is a presence. It is the act of looking at something, a piece of clothing, a patch of skin, a small dark corner of a room, and deciding that it is worth your time and your effort to make it right. That is what the woman at the hearth was doing, and that is what the barber was doing. That is what we are doing when we look after ourselves. We are all in our own time, curators of our own existence. We are managing the gap between the world as it is and the world as we wish it to be. And the fact that we have been doing this for centuries, without perfect knowledge, without modern tools, and often against great odds, is nothing short of a miracle. As the night grows even quieter, as the lights of the world outside fade into the soft distance, let yourself hold on to this. You are a part of a long human story. You are doing your best, just as they did, and your best in this moment is simply to be here, to breathe, and to let go of the need to be anything other than exactly who you are. As we continue to let the day unwind, consider the liberation that comes with understanding history. When we look at the 18th century, a time of such limited knowledge, yet such profound effort, we are reminded that perfection has never been the price of admission for a life well lived. They didn't have the perfect solution for hygiene, yet they lived, they loved, they raised families, and they built a world that allowed us to be here, listening to this story tonight. There is a lesson in that for us, isn't there? We spend so much of our modern lives chasing an idea of optimized living, the right diet, the right routines, the right way to care for ourselves. But sometimes the pursuit of that optimization becomes a source of stress in itself. We lose sight of the fact that care is, at its heart, a simple, gentle act of self-respect. It is not about reaching a standard set by someone else. It is about recognizing that your body is a vessel for your existence, and it deserves to be treated with kindness regardless of the tools you have at hand. Think of the person back in 1750, preparing for bed. They didn't have the technology to make their life easy, but they had the capability to appreciate the small relief of a clean shirt, the warmth of a fire, or the quiet moment of preparation before sleep. They found satisfaction in the work they had accomplished. Even if the work was never truly finished, they knew intuitively that the struggle for health and order was a lifelong journey, not a final destination. We too are on that journey every night. We engage in our own small rituals of maintenance, our own ways of preparing to rest. Whether it is washing your face, changing into comfortable clothes, or simply taking a deep, slow breath, you are honoring that same ancient human need for sanctuary. You are reclaiming your space, calming your mind, and acknowledging that for today your efforts were enough. Let yourself feel that sense of enough, the day's demands, the worries that kept you occupied, the plans for tomorrow. They can all be set aside for a little while. They are no longer your concern. Right now there is only the slow rhythm of your breathing, the warmth of your surroundings, and the quiet comfort of being exactly where you are. You don't have to carry the weight of the world, you only have to exist within this moment of rest. Let the history rest, let the past settle into its place, and let yourself sink into the stillness, deeper and deeper, until there is nothing left but the quiet presence of your own being. To truly understand how a person lived in the 1700s, we must look at the architecture of their lives, the very walls that enclosed them. In the rapidly expanding cities of the 18th century, space was the ultimate luxury. Whether you were in a narrow, multi-storied house in London's Spitalfields or a bustling apartment building in Paris, the domestic environment was one of forced intimacy. Think of the verticality of these dwellings. A family might occupy only 1 or 2 rooms on a single floor, with a shared staircase acting as the only artery connecting them to the street. In this environment, privacy was not a room you could lock. It was a delicate social agreement. The way you washed, the way you handled your waste, the way you prepared your food, all of this happened within a few feet of your neighbors. This physical proximity forced a unique kind of social etiquette. You had to be mindful of your noise, your smells, and your chores, because your walls were thin and your neighbors were constant witnesses to your daily rhythm. This architectural reality dictated the hygiene of the time. If you didn't have a private yard, your laundry had to be dried on rooftops or hung from windows, creating a landscape of fluttering white linen that defined the skyline of the city. This was a visible, public statement of your household's commitment to cleanliness. To have dirty laundry hanging from your window was a sign of a household in decline, while pristine white shirts signaled a family that was still maintaining its dignity against the grime of the city. There is a fascinating link here between architecture and power. The wealthiest homes could afford to hide their domestic labor. Their kitchens, their laundries, and their privies were tucked away in basements or distant wings, handled by unseen servants. But for the vast majority of people, the work of keeping clean was fully visible. It was part of the urban experience. You could walk down a street and by the state of the washing, by the scent of the air, or by the sounds emanating from the houses, get a clear sense of the community's health and order. As you lean back and let your mind wander, imagine moving through one of these old buildings. You hear the creak of the floorboards, the muffled conversation from the floor above, the faint, lingering smell of beeswax and wood smoke. It was a world of intense localized existence. Every action was amplified by the smallness of the space. You were never truly alone. You were always a part of a larger collective life. It was a life lived in harmony with your surroundings, where the building itself felt like an extension of your own body. What does it feel like, this idea of living so close to others, so reliant on the architecture of your environment to define your daily routine? We are still governed by the spaces we inhabit today, though we have forgotten the profound ways our ancestors were tethered to the very walls that held them. We have spoken of the apothecary's shop as a sanctuary, but we must also acknowledge the vibrant, chaotic marketplace that served as the true pulse of 18th century hygiene. For the ordinary person who could not afford the curated tinctures of a high-end apothecary, the market was the place of innovation here. You would find the travelling merchants, their carts laden with everything from medicinal herbs to soaps, oils, and the strange metallic pastes used for teeth. The market was where the gap between the rich and the poor was bridged, at least in theory. A merchant shouting his wares in the centre of the square offered the same peppermint oil to the merchant's wife as he did to the labourer's daughter. The marketplace was a great equalizer of information. It was where the latest rumours about the benefits of a certain mineral or the newest method for whitening linen were shared and debated. The vendors were the unofficial educators of the 18th century, translating the complex botanical knowledge of the time into something that could be bought for a few copper coins. Think of the sensory overload of that space, the smell of raw wool mixing with the sharp scent of rosemary, the sound of iron wheels on cobblestones, the aggressive rhythmic calls of the traders. It was a world that felt dangerous to some, yet it was the only way most people could procure the materials necessary to sustain their lives. You were not just buying goods, you were participating in a system of survival. You were purchasing the ingredients to make your own soap, the herbs to scent your home, and the tools to mend your family's clothes. This marketplace culture reveals a critical truth about the 18th century. The idea of personal care was an active, constant negotiation with the economy. Nothing was simply given, everything had to be sought out, bargained for, and then repurposed. When you see a merchant in the background of an 18th century painting, know that he is the vital artery of the city's health. He is the one bringing the lavender from the fields to the kitchen, the one distributing the materials that allowed the city to keep functioning against the tide of its own filth. As you reflect on this, consider how far we have come from that necessity. We walk into a store today and expect everything to be waiting for us, refined and ready. But in the 1700s, the connection between your health and the market was direct, personal and fraught with potential for both discovery and deception. You had to know your merchant, you had to know your ingredients, and you had to trust in the process of the trade. It was a precarious existence, yet there was a strength in that directness. You were never a passive consumer, you were a vital participant in the infrastructure of your own survival. Is there a part of you that wonders what it would be like to stand in that square, to have to personally hunt for the things that keep you healthy, and to know the history of every single item in your hand? Let us shift our focus to the newcomers, the people who arrived in the bustling capital cities from the quiet, rural villages, carrying nothing but their belongings and a set of habits shaped by the land. Imagine the disorientation of a family moving from a hillside farm to a dense, smoke-filled district in London. They arrived with the rhythm of the seasons still in their blood, only to be confronted with the relentless artificial rhythm of the city. For these newcomers, the struggle for cleanliness was not just about maintaining their health, it was about preserving their identity. They brought with them the herbal remedies of their mothers, the specific ways of folding linen, and the deep-seated belief that fresh air and sunlight were the only true purifiers. But in the city, the air was heavy with the soot of 1,000 coal fires, and sunlight rarely reached the narrow alleys. They had to learn how to adapt these rural rituals to an urban environment. They had to learn where to find the cleanest water, which merchants could be trusted not to dilute their goods, and how to negotiate the complex social landscape of the tenement buildings. It was a period of intense learning, a process of shedding the old ways and grafting on new ones. They became the bridge between two worlds, often clinging to the old herbs while learning to use the city's chemical solutions. Consider the anxiety of that transition. To be a stranger in a city that seemed to be actively working against your health must have been a daunting experience, yet it is within this struggle that we see the true resilience of the human spirit. They did not abandon their commitment to care, they simply innovated. They found ways to grow herbs in window boxes, they bartered for cleaner linens with their neighbours, and they built small networks of mutual aid. They were the ones who kept the community traditions alive, ensuring that even in the middle of a concrete and smoke-filled landscape, the old gentle rituals of care were not entirely forgotten. As you sit in the quiet of your room, think of those people, the strangers in a strange land, who did their absolute best to keep their families whole, healthy, and clean in the face of immense change. Their struggle is the history of every person who has ever had to start over, ever had to build a home from scratch in an environment that felt cold and indifferent. It is a story of adaptation, of persistence, and of the quiet, enduring power of the routines we create for ourselves. How does it feel to think of them building their own small sanctuaries in the heart of the city, using nothing but the memories of home and the hope of a better tomorrow? In the 18th century, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the world didn't just grow dark, it grew smaller. The interior of a home, especially during the long, damp winter months, became a refuge dominated by the flickering light of the candle. This brings us to the craft of the chandler, the maker of candles, whose work was fundamental to the rhythm of hygiene and care. Imagine the workshop of a chandler. It was a space filled with the heavy, waxy scent of tallow-rendered animal fat hanging in the cool air. The process was a study in patience, dipping a wick into the molten fat, letting it cool, then dipping it again and again, building layer upon layer of light. These candles were the only thing that stood between a family and the crushing, damp darkness of the night. But why, you might ask, does this relate to hygiene? Because light was the precursor to care. You could not mend a garment in the dark. You could not inspect a wound, check the cleanliness of a bowl, or tend to a sick child without the steady flame of a tallow candle. To live in the 18th century was to be a master of the flame. Every household budget had a line item for light, and every housewife knew the preciousness of that burning wick. When the light was low, the work stopped. When the light was lit, the business of keeping the body alive resumed. Think of the psychological comfort that a lit candle provided. In a city where the streets were dangerous and the night felt like an enemy, the glow of a candle in a window was a beacon. It was a silent message to the neighbours and the world that this home was cared for, that it was a space where order was being maintained. It was an act of defiance against the decay that the darkness seemed to invite. The candle was the hearth's smaller portable cousin, a captured piece of fire that allowed the inhabitants of the 18th century to reclaim the night. As you reflect on this, notice the light in your own room, the way it is so effortlessly available, so perfectly steady. We have removed the labour, the smoke, and the constant fear of running out, but we have perhaps lost a bit of that awareness of how precious light truly is. In the 1700s, light was a measured commodity. It was spent with intention. Every minute of candlelight was a minute of human activity, a minute of care, a minute of holding the world together. Doesn't that make you view the soft glow of your own environment with a bit more quiet gratitude? It is an ancient lineage, this human desire to push back the dark, to see and to be seen. In the crowded, narrow streets of an 18th century metropolis, nothing was truly considered waste in the way we think of it today. There was an entire sub-economy built around the collection of what others discarded, driven by the rag-and-bone men, the scavengers who walked the cobbles with a singular purpose. They were the essential agents of urban renewal, though their work was rarely acknowledged by the society they helped clean. Consider the humble cotton or linen rag. To a wealthy household, it was a worn-out garment, no longer fit for the parlour. To the rag-and-bone man, it was a commodity. These scraps were collected, sorted, and sold to paper mills, where they were pulped and transformed into the very pages upon which the laws, letters, and literature of the age were written. The connection is startling. The discarded fabric of a poor person's life became the canvas for the intellectual history of a nation. It was a cycle of reuse that was both pragmatic and profoundly poetic. These collectors were the eyes and ears of the city. They knew every alleyway, every hidden yard, and every household's habits. They dealt in bones, which were used for fertilizer or buttons, in scrap metal, which was melted down, and in anything else that held a shred of residual value. Their existence was a testament to the era's scarcity, but also to its efficiency in a world where raw materials were expensive and manufacturing was labour-intensive. The ability to repurpose was the difference between a functional city and one that would have collapsed under its own refuse. There is a lesson here about our own relationship with the discarded. We often live in an age of disposable convenience, where the history of an object ends the moment we throw it away. But in the 18th century, every object had a future. A cloth lived many lives, first as a shirt, then as a cleaning rag, then as a component of paper, and finally, perhaps, as something else entirely. The rag-and-bone man was the curator of this afterlife. He ensured that the city did not choke on its own history, but rather folded it back into the present. As the night continues to settle, think about the objects around you. We live in a world designed to forget where things come from and where they go. Yet the 18th century model reminds us that everything we use is part of a longer, interconnected thread. The rags, the bones, the metal, they were the physical connections that held the social fabric together. It was a messy, loud, and sometimes grim trade, but it was also a form of stewardship. It was a way of respecting the material world, of acknowledging that everything has a value, provided one has the patience to find it. Doesn't that change how you look at the items in your own home? Everything around you has a story, a history of transformation, and a purpose that goes far beyond its current use. If the marketplace was the city's pulse, then the domestic recipe book, that precious handwritten ledger kept by the mistress of the house, was the city's memory. These were not just cookbooks as we know them today, they were encyclopedias of survival. Within their leather-bound covers, tucked away on shelves in dim kitchens, one could find the secret methods for everything from removing stubborn wine stains from lace to decocting a willow bark tea to soothe a fever. These volumes were passed down through generations, each daughter adding her own observations, her own experiments, and the wisdom she had gathered from her neighbours. It was a private, feminine science. While the male-dominated medical community of the 18th century often relied on complex, often erratic theoretical frameworks. The domestic recipe book was built on empirical evidence. It was, this salve worked on the neighbour's burn, or this mixture of vinegar and herbs cleaned the hearth more effectively than plain water. It was knowledge grounded in the body and the home. The discipline required to keep such a book was immense. You had to monitor the seasons to know when to harvest your herbs for maximum potency. You had to understand the chemistry of fats and oils, and you had to possess the organizational skill to manage a household's inventory of supplies. In a time when a simple infection could be devastating, these books were the primary defense line of the family. They were the evidence of a woman's role as the chief steward of her household's health and cleanliness. Consider the intimacy of these pages. The ink slightly smudged by kitchen spills, the margins filled with hurried notes in a fading hand. They are the physical record of 1,000 small daily battles for order and comfort. When we read them today, we aren't just seeing old-fashioned tips. We are looking at the foundational logic of the modern household. We are looking at the origin of the caretaking instinct that continues to define our own private lives. As you drift further into the stillness of the night, think of that quiet, focused labour, the scratching of a quill on parchment, the thoughtful annotation of a remedy, the pride of a well-maintained home. It was a life defined by observation and the quiet, persistent desire to make the world, or at least the four walls of one's room, a better, safer place. It is a heritage of diligence that still echoes in the way we prepare our own spaces for rest. When you arrange your pillows, when you dim the lights, when you settle into your covers, you are performing the latest act in a very old tradition of creating a sanctuary. Does it bring you peace to know that this rhythm of care is a part of your story, handed down through centuries of hands just like your own? In the 18th century, the barber's shop was a place where the boundaries between the aesthetic and the clinical were famously blurred. We think of barbers today as stylists, but in the 1700s they were the barber-surgeons. Their shop was a hub of public life, a place where you went to be cleaned up, to hear the latest news, and if your ailment required it, to have a tooth extracted or a vein bled to balance your humours. Imagine the atmosphere. It was a space saturated with the sharp, clean scent of lye soaps and the metallic tang of polished steel. The barber was a master of the razor, and in a world without safety blades or electric clippers, his steady hand was a matter of extreme trust. He had to know the anatomy of the face as well as the behaviour of his blade. He was the one who maintained the social face of the community, ensuring that the gentleman was presentable, the merchant was groomed, and the labourer was trimmed of his wilder edges. But his duties went deeper, because he was already in the business of blades. It was a natural extension of his trade to be the neighbourhood's first line of surgical defence. If you had a lingering pain, an infected wound, or a tooth that wouldn't stop aching, the barber was the one you consulted. He was a practitioner of a pragmatic, rough-and-ready medicine. His tools were kept clean, or as clean as the standards of the time permitted, in jars of spirits or hot water. Not because he understood bacteria, but because he understood that clean tools produced better, more reliable results. This duality of the barber-surgeon tells us something important about the era. The division of labour was not as rigid as we imagine. People were expected to be multifunctional. The man who cut your hair was the same man who bandaged your arm. The skill required to wield a razor was fundamentally linked to the skill required to perform minor surgery. It was an era that valued the handyman, the one who could adapt their expertise to whatever crisis the day presented. As you sit in the quiet of your room, let your mind rest on this image of the barber-surgeon. Think of the intense focus required to work on a person's skin with nothing but steel and steady nerves. It was a trade of constant close-up contact, a dance between the practitioner and the patient. In a world that could be quite chaotic, the barber's shop offered a strange anchored sense of order. When you settle into your own bed, think of how modern life has specialized these roles, separating the grooming from the healing, yet still leaving us with that ancient need for someone we trust to take care of us. It is a comforting thought, isn't it? that for centuries we have relied on these skilled hands to help us present our best selves to the world and to help us mend when we are broken. In the 18th century, the garden was more than a mere aesthetic choice. It was a physical manifestation of order imposed upon a wild, unpredictable world. The head gardener of a grand English manor was a figure of significant authority, a master of landscape, botany, and the seasonal cycles that governed both the pantry and the medicine cabinet. To walk through these meticulously curated spaces was to step into a vision of a world that was entirely under control. Think of the gardener's labour. It was a life lived in the soil, defined by the turning of the earth, the pruning of the hedges, and the tireless battle against weeds and pests. But beyond the beauty of the flowers, the gardener was the primary provider of the household's pharmacy. The lavender, the chamomile, the rosemary, and the sage that were used to scent the linens, to cleanse the skin, and to brew the evening teas, they all began here, under his watchful eye. He was a scientist of growth, understanding precisely when a plant was at its peak for healing and how to dry it to preserve its virtues through the long dark winter. There was a profound connection between the cleanliness of the manor and the discipline of the garden. The paths were swept, the edges were trimmed, and everything was in its place. This outer order was meant to reflect the inner health of the family. A garden in decay was seen as a sign of moral or physical neglect, while a garden in full, structured bloom was proof of a household that was thriving. The gardener worked in silence, often unseen by the guests who walked the gravel paths, yet his influence was in every scent that wafted through the drawing-room windows and every tonic that eased a tired body. This is a perspective worth considering, the garden as a bridge between the wildness of nature and the sanitation of the home. The gardener took the chaotic energy of the sun and rain and, through labour and knowledge, turned it into something that could bring comfort, health, and a sense of serenity to the people within the house. He was the one who ensured that even in the heart of a busy estate there was a quiet, green sanctuary where one could retreat from the stresses of social expectation. As you lean back into the stillness of your room, try to imagine the scent of that 18th century garden. Let the smell of crushed herbs and fresh, damp earth fill your senses. It was a place of deep, grounding peace. Even if you don't have a garden of your own tonight, you are still surrounded by the legacy of that desire for sanctuary. You have created your own space of rest, a place where you can detach from the noise and find a moment of stillness. In a way, you are your own gardener, tending to the quiet corners of your life, ensuring that your environment serves your need for peace. Does it feel good to acknowledge that you too have the power to create a sanctuary where the world's chaos is kept at bay, and where you can simply exist in the calm you have cultivated? We have looked at the gardens, the workshops, and the streets, but we must now turn our attention to the silent, sturdy protectors of the 18th century home, the woodworkers and furniture makers. In an era where dust, soot, and damp were constant intruders, the craftsmanship of a well-made cabinet, a solid trunk, or a tightly fitted wardrobe was the primary defence of one's belongings. Imagine the workshop of a master joiner. It was a place of sensory harmony, the smell of freshly planed oak or pine, the rhythmic rasp of the saw, and the sight of intricate joints coming together with satisfying precision. These men were not merely making furniture, they were creating systems of order. A chest of drawers was a defence mechanism. A lidded box was a fortress for one's linens, shielding them from the soot that filtered in through every chimney and window crack. To have your belongings tucked away in a well-fitted, handcrafted piece of furniture was to possess a sense of control over your own small domain. There was a profound pride in this work. A woodworker knew that his creation had to last for decades, often outliving the very people who commissioned it. He used techniques dovetail joints, pegged mortise and tenon that required no metal nails, ensuring that as the wood expanded and contracted with the seasons, the structure would remain sound. He was building the skeleton of domesticity. Every drawer that glided smoothly, every door that clicked shut with a satisfying thud was a victory for organization against the encroaching chaos of the urban environment. Consider the intimacy of these objects. For a woman living in a crowded tenement, a single wooden trunk might be the only place she could safely store her spare shift, her soap, and her recipe book. It was her private sanctuary, a portable home within a home. The craftsmanship of that trunk, the way the lid sat flush, the way the wood felt under her fingertips, was a source of quiet dignity. It proved that even in a difficult life, there was something she owned that was built to endure. As you look around your own room tonight, observe the furniture that surrounds you. We live in an age of mass-produced materials, yet the need for that same order remains. We still use cabinets to hide the clutter, drawers to organize our lives, and surfaces that we wipe clean to feel a sense of clarity. The woodworkers of the 1700s understood what we often forget, that how we store our things is a reflection of how we manage our own peace of mind. By creating order, they created a container for the human spirit to rest. Doesn't it feel grounding to realize that this desire to contain and protect our personal space is a thread that connects us to those ancestors who stood at their benches, shaving wood into the perfect shape for a simple, sturdy home? If the cabinet maker built the fortress of the home, the laundress ensured the dignity of those who lived within it. We have touched upon the labor of the wash, but let us look closer at the world of the professional laundress, a woman whose entire life was governed by the physics of water, heat, and lye. Her workspace was a battlefield of steam and suds, often located in the dampest, dimmest parts of the city, where she worked for hours on end. Her hands perpetually reddened, her back bowed under the weight of wet, heavy linen. This was not a job for the faint of heart. It was a rigorous, highly skilled trade. A laundress had to know the temperaments of different fabrics, how to treat delicate fine lace differently than coarse household sheets, how to bleach white linen using nothing but the sun and a careful application of lemon or sour milk, and how to get stubborn coal dust out of a gentleman's collar without destroying the fibres. She was a master of chemistry. Although she didn't have the scientific vocabulary to name the reactions she triggered, she knew the power of the boiling copper pot and the essential necessity of the rinse. Then there was the art of the ironer. Once the linen was dried, often high up on rooftops, exposed to the city soot, it had to be pressed. The irons themselves were heavy lumps of forged iron, heated on the fire, then tested with a drop of water to see if they hissed at just the right pitch. To move that iron across a shirt, to smooth out every wrinkle, to bring a crisp architectural finish to a collar or a cuff, this was a performance of precision. It was about reclaiming the dignity of the person who would wear the garment, ensuring they could walk out into the world looking clean, composed, and worthy of respect. Think of the contrast, the filth of the 18th century street, the grime of the coal-burning city, and then the startling, brilliant white of a fresh shirt. The laundress was the bridge between those two worlds. She was the one who systematically erased the evidence of the city's harshness. Every time someone put on a clean garment, they were benefiting from this invisible, arduous labor. It was a cycle of renewal that relied entirely on the dedication of these women who worked in the steam, day after day, keeping the social fabric of the era from literally becoming as soiled as the environment around it. As you reflect on this, consider the clothes you wear, the ease with which you care for them, the gentle hum of a modern machine doing the work that once took an entire day of physical exhaustion. We have become detached from the effort that goes into our most basic comforts. But tonight, as you drift toward deeper rest, allow yourself to acknowledge the labor of care that has always been the foundation of civilization. You are resting on the legacy of all those who understood that cleanliness was not just a luxury, but a vital act of defiance against the decay of the world. It is a quiet, powerful thought, isn't it? That behind every clean surface, every crisp fold, there is a history of human intention, of hands working to make life just a little bit better, a little bit lighter, and a little bit more peaceful. We have journeyed through the heat of the laundry and the scent of the woodworker's shop, but let us now pause in the quietest place of all, the paper mill and the scrivener's desk. In the 18th century, paper was a precious, tangible substance. It was born from the very rags we discussed earlier, pulped, pressed, and dried into sheets that felt like skin under the quill. To write on paper was an act of permanence, a way of anchoring a thought against the tide of time. Think of the paper maker's work. It was a rhythmic meditative process, involving the rhythmic dipping of a wooden frame into a vat of fibre-rich slurry. It required a keen eye for density, an understanding of the drying conditions, and a patience that matched the slow growth of the garden. Each sheet was unique, bearing the watermark of the mill and the texture of the craftsman's touch. When you picked up a pen in the 1700s, you were holding a piece of history that had been carefully prepared for you by human hands. And then there was the scrivener, the one who took those sheets and transformed them into the architecture of thought in a world of flickering candlelight and scratchy quills. Writing was a physical endurance. It required posture, discipline, and a deep focus. The ink itself, often made from iron gall, oak galls, and vitriol, was a chemical concoction that darkened and bonded with the paper over time, ensuring that the words would outlive the person who wrote them. This was how history was recorded, not through digital signals, but through the literal permanent staining of fibre. This labour of preservation tells us something vital about the 18th century mindset. They were obsessed with legacy. They knew their lives were fragile, prone to the diseases and environmental challenges we have explored, but they believed that their ideas, their accounts, and their stories could survive. Every letter sent, every recipe book filled, every ledger balanced, was a way of saying, I was here, I observed this, I managed this. It was a form of intellectual cleanliness, an attempt to organize the chaos of experience into a record that others could understand. As you sit in the silence of your room, think of those millions of pages filled with handwriting, some hurried and desperate, others elegant and calm. These were the screens of the 18th century. They allowed people to reach across time and space, to share a remedy, a news report, or a private thought. We have replaced the quill with the keyboard, but the need to document our existence remains. We still want to be remembered, to be recorded, and to make sense of our journey. How does it feel to know that you're part of that same long narrative, leaving your own mark on the world, even in the quiet, unseen ways you organize your life and your thoughts before you close your eyes for the night? As we draw nearer to the end of our journey through the daily lives of those who kept the world functioning in the 1700s, we must consider the keepers of the rhythm themselves, the clockmakers. In an age before synchronized digital time, the clock was a revolutionary object. It was a mechanical heart placed in the center of a home or a workshop, reminding everyone that time was a finite, precious resource. To be a clockmaker was to be an engineer of the intangible. Imagine the interior of a clockmaker's shop. It was a space of intense microscopic focus. The air was kept unusually still to protect the delicate, tiny gears from the slightest speck of dust. If a grain of grit found its way into the mechanism, the entire rhythm of the day would be thrown off. The craftsman sat at his bench, a jeweller's loop pressed to his eye, his hands moving with a steadiness that bordered on the superhuman. He was measuring reality, second by agonizingly small second. For the ordinary person in the 18th century, the clock was a tether to the wider world. Whether it was the chime of the church tower or the steady ticking of a tall case clock in the hallway, these sounds provided a framework for life. They dictated when the workday began, when the hearth was lit, and when it was time to finally cease the day's labours. The clockmaker didn't just build machines, he built the structure of human expectation. He ensured that the community was moving in tandem, that the merchant, the laundress, the gardener, and the scriveners were all participating in the same shared day. There is a profound humility in the clockmaker's trade. He knew that despite all his precision, time would continue to move forward, indifferent to his gears and springs. Yet by building these instruments, he allowed humanity to carve out a little bit of order from the vast unknown expanse of the future. He provided the framework for the rituals of care we have been exploring. Without the ability to track time, there would be no proper time to wash, no proper time to rest, and no way to organize the domestic routines that kept the household sane. As you sit in the stillness of your own home, listen for a moment to the silence. You don't need a ticking clock to tell you that the day has concluded, for your own body has its own internal rhythm, an ancient clock that knows when the labor is done and the restorative phase must begin. Think of the clockmaker working in that dusty, quiet light, striving to capture the heartbeat of the world in brass and steel. You are the beneficiary of that long, historical effort to measure and honor the passage of time. And now, as you prepare to let the day fade away, realize that you no longer need to measure anything. The time for measuring is over. The time for being, for breathing, and for letting go has arrived. Does it feel like a relief to release the grip on time and simply drift into the present? As we contemplate the physical world of the 1700s, we cannot overlook the potter, the master of earth and fire, who provided the essential vessels for human survival. Every drop of water carried into a home, every ration of grain or flour stored in a pantry, and every medicinal decoction prepared in a kitchen required a container. The potter's work was the foundation of domestic storage, a silent partner in the struggle against decay. Think of the potter's wheel spinning with a hypnotic, rhythmic intensity. The potter's hands, coated in cooling clay, were the only tools needed to pull a form from a lump of grey earth. This was a process of constant negotiation with the material. If the clay was too wet, it collapsed. If it was too dry, it cracked. It required an intuitive understanding of the environment, the moisture in the air, the quality of the local clay pits, and the precise temperature needed in the kiln. Once fired, the clay became ceramic, a material that was non-porous, cleanable, and incredibly durable. In a world where hygiene was a constant battle, the ceramic vessel was a triumph of sanitation. Unlike wood, which could harbour dampness and rot, or metal, which could rust, glazed ceramic could be scrubbed clean. It was the preferred material for the bowls from which families ate, and the basins in which they washed their hands. The potter was effectively a contributor to the health of every household. By providing these smooth, impermeable surfaces, he gave the average person a way to keep their food and their water pure, even in the midst of a dusty city. Consider the intimacy of a simple ceramic jug. It might have been the first thing a person touched in the morning to pour water for washing, and the last thing they touched at night to set out a drink. It held the nourishment that kept them alive. The potter knew that his creations would be handled 1,000 times over, held in hands that were tired, hands that were clean, hands that were working. There was a quiet humanity in this trade. It was about creating the interface between the human body and the resources required to sustain it. As you lean back into your own space tonight, think of the humble vessels that populate your world, the glass you drink from, the plate you use, the basin in your room. They are the descendants of those ancient ceramic forms, the silent assistants of your own daily rituals. We often take for granted the purity of the materials we use, forgetting that for centuries, the very ability to keep one's life clean was a direct result of these sturdy, fired earth protectors. When you look at the objects around you, try to see them not just as tools, but as the quiet companions of your existence, helping you maintain the order and the sanctity of your private world. Doesn't that make the simple act of using a cup or a bowl feel like a continuation of a very long, very human story of care? To understand the 18th century, we must stand for a moment before the glowing forge of the blacksmith. If the potter gave us the vessels of life, the blacksmith gave us the tools to protect and modify that life. His workshop was a place of elemental transformation, where iron, cold, hard, and unyielding, was brought to its knees by the combination of fire and the hammer. Imagine the sound, the rhythmic ringing strike of hammer against anvil, a sound that defined the industrial music of the age. The blacksmith was the essential architect of the home's security and functionality. He forged the heavy iron hinges that allowed a door to swing true, sealing a room against the cold draughts or the prying eyes of the street. He crafted the fireplace irons, the heavy pot cranes that suspended the cooking vessels over the flames, and the fire dogs that held the logs. ensuring that the heat was managed safely and efficiently. He was the one who made it possible for the home to be an island of regulated warmth in a damp, unpredictable world. There was a profound sense of permanence in his work. A well-wrought iron latch or a sturdy fireplace grate was built to last for generations, often outliving the very house it was installed in. In a world where so much was fragile, where cloth wore thin, wood decayed and glass shattered, the blacksmith's iron was the reliable constant. It was the backbone of domestic stability. When you closed an iron bolt at night, you were relying on the strength of a craft that understood the necessity of safety and the importance of having a boundary between your private sanctuary and the outside world. But beyond the utility, there was a quiet art to this trade. The blacksmith understood the specific temperament of iron, how it behaved when white-hot, how it resisted when cooling, and how it could be shaped into both a brutal tool and an elegant curved hook. He was a master of resistance. He knew that to create something lasting, he had to work with the nature of the material, not against it. This was a lesson that the society of the 1700s held dear, that order was not something easily won, but something forged through patience, intense heat, and the disciplined application of force. As you sit in the quiet of your room, let your mind rest on the strength of the structures that hold your world together, the hinges that keep your doors steady, the metal frames that support your environment. They are all descendants of that ancient forge. We have replaced the ringing anvil with the silence of mass production, but the need for that sense of security, that feeling of being enclosed and protected, remains the same. When you settle into your space, listen to the quiet stability of your surroundings. You are safe. The boundaries of your sanctuary are secure, held in place by a lineage of craft and care that has been protecting the human home for centuries. Doesn't that sense of being held, of being protected by the very structure of your room, allow you to let go just a little bit more and sink deeper into the comfort of your rest? In the 18th century, light was not merely an absence of dark, it was a curated experience, and the people responsible for this were the glassmakers and glaziers. To look through a window in the early 1700s was a vastly different experience than it is today. Glass was expensive, often wavy, and riddled with tiny bubbles, yet it was the ultimate mark of a home that had successfully invited the world inside, while still keeping the elements at bay. Imagine the glass house, a cathedral of intense heat, where men blew molten sand and ash into glowing spheres, spinning them until they flattened into discs, or carefully stretching them into cylinders to be cut and flattened into panes. It was a perilous, breathtaking craft. The glazier then took these fragile sheets, scoring them with a diamond-tipped tool and fitting them into lead cames, the thin, flexible channels of lead that held the individual pieces of glass in a lattice pattern. This was the delicate intersection of light and security. A window wasn't just a view, it was a barrier that allowed you to see the world without having to touch it. For the inhabitant of an 18th century home, a clean, clear window pane was a luxury that redefined the interior. It allowed the shifting beauty of the seasons to enter the room, the golden light of afternoon, the pale grey of a misty morning, while protecting the occupants from the damp and the draught. It transformed the home into an observatory. Consider the fragility of this existence. A stray stone, a heavy storm, or even the settling of a house could shatter that carefully crafted barrier. The glazier was a constant presence in the maintenance of a well-ordered home, called upon to replace the broken, to seal the gaps against the winter chill, and to ensure that the light continued to flow. He was the guardian of transparency, the one who maintained the boundary between the private interior self and the public external city. As you look around your own room tonight, observe the way the light catches on the surfaces of your windows. We have developed the technology to make glass perfectly clear, large and seamless, but the fundamental joy of that interface, the ability to be both inside and part of the world, is a thread that links you directly to those who lived 3 centuries ago. There is a quiet, profound magic in a pane of glass. It holds the warmth of your room in, while inviting the stars or the morning light to join you in your sanctuary. As you prepare to close your eyes, think of that soft filtered light, that gentle boundary between you and the vastness of the outside. It is a protective, elegant barrier, isn't it? A final, beautiful detail in the house of your own mind as you move toward the quiet, deep stillness of the night. We have explored the walls that shelter us and the tools that serve us, but now we must turn to the foundation of the person themselves, the footwear. In the 18th century, the cordwainer or shoemaker was a vital figure in the community. To walk through an 18th century city was to navigate a landscape of mud, uneven cobblestones and grime. A good, well-crafted pair of shoes was not a fashion statement. It was a survival tool. Imagine the cordwainer's workshop. It was a space defined by the deep, rich smell of tanned leather, beeswax and wood. His work was a labour of intense, repetitive precision. He did not simply glue materials together. He utilised the strength of waxed linen thread and the durability of hardened leather soles. He sat on a low stool, the last, a wooden foot-shaped form cradled in his lap, stitching the upper leather to the sole with an awl and needle. Every stitch had to be tight. Every seam had to be reinforced to withstand the relentless damp of the streets. There was a profound understanding of the human foot in his trade. He knew that a labourer walking 10 miles a day needed a different fit than a merchant's wife moving through a parlour. He had to account for the way leather stretched, how it softened with heat and hardened with cold, and how to make a shoe that could be repaired again and again. A pair of shoes was an investment that could last for years, with the cobbler, the repairman of the neighbourhood, replacing the soles as they wore down. The shoe was a renewable resource, a testament to the era's commitment to maintenance. Consider the intimacy of the bond between the person and their footwear. These were the objects that touched the very earth, the direct point of contact between the individual and the city. To step into a pair of sturdy, broken-in shoes was to feel ready to face the world. It was a grounding experience. The cordwainer's work ensured that even when the streets were at their worst, the individual could move with purpose, stability, and protection. He was, in a sense, the provider of the rhythm of movement that kept the city alive. As you sit in the quiet of your room, think of the ground beneath you and the long journey of human movement that has brought us to this moment. We have become accustomed to shoes that are lightweight, soft and ephemeral, yet the essential need for a stable foundation remains. There is a comfort in knowing that for centuries, dedicated hands have worked to ensure that we could walk, stand, and move safely through the world. As you prepare to rest, release the need to move, to stand, or to travel. Let your feet rest, fully unburdened, and feel the weight of your body sink into the softness of your sanctuary. You have travelled far today, and now you have reached the place where all movement stops and only stillness remains. Isn't it a profound relief to let the journey end and simply settle into the peace of your own space? While we previously visited the world of the tallow chandler, the maker of everyday fat-based light, we must now step into the brighter, more fragrant workshop of the wax chandler. This was a trade of refinement. Unlike the heavy, sometimes pungent smell of animal tallow, the wax chandler worked with beeswax, a golden, sweet-smelling substance that burned with a clean, steady and brilliant flame. To walk into his workshop was to enter a space of light gold and honeyed perfume, a stark contrast to the grit and damp of the urban streets. The process of creating a beeswax candle was an act of patience. It involved bleaching the raw wax in the sun, melting it, and carefully pouring it into moulds or layering it upon a wick. These candles did not sputter or smoke. They stood tall and proud in the chandeliers of the grand manors, casting a warm, luminous glow that highlighted the textures of silk, the polished finish of mahogany, and the intricate details of a home's interior. They were the beacons of the affluent, representing a commitment to a life that was not only organized, but also aesthetically pure. Yet this trade was about more than just wealth. It was about the quality of the seeing. Because these candles burned cleaner, they allowed for better visibility during the long dark hours. They were used to illuminate the books being read, the letters being written, and the social gatherings where etiquette and order were strictly observed. The wax chandler provided the tools for clarity. He was the one who ensured that even when the sun had long since set, the world inside the manor remained vibrant, clear, and visible. There is something poignant about the wax chandler's devotion to purity. He dealt in a material that was essentially sunlight captured, collected by bees from the meadows, and transformed by his craft into a tool for human use. It was a bridge between the wild beauty of nature and the refined interior of the home. In an age where air quality was a constant concern, the choice to use beeswax was an act of environmental control, a decision to minimize smoke and maximize the cleanliness of the living space. As you lean back in your room, reflect on the different ways we have learned to hold back the darkness. From the humble tallow candle that kept the hearth alive to the refined beeswax flame that graced the halls of the elite, all were driven by the same human necessity, the need to keep the world bright, to keep the shadows at bay, and to maintain a space where we could feel seen and safe. As your own light begins to dim and you prepare to drift away, appreciate the gentle quiet that accompanies the end of the day. The candles are extinguished, the work is done, and the world outside is hushed. You have been a part of this long history of seeking light, but now there is no need to see, only to feel the safety of your sanctuary as you let the darkness wrap around you, soft and comforting. Doesn't it feel like a final gentle exhale to let go of the need to see and simply trust in the quiet stillness that surrounds you? If the common potter provided the sturdy vessels for survival, the master of fine ceramics provided the vessels for living well. As the 18th century progressed, the fascination with porcelain, that white gold, transformed the tables of the manor houses and the cabinets of the curious. To witness a master ceramist at work was to see a tension between extreme delicacy and immense strength. This was a trade of high art, where the kiln was not just a tool, but a temperamental judge of one's skill. Imagine the focus required to fire a piece of fine porcelain. The furnace had to be maintained at a precise, blistering heat for hours. Too little, and the piece would remain brittle. Too much, and it would warp or shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces. The master worked with kaolin clay, a pure white earth that demanded absolute cleanliness. A single stray speck of dust or impurity from the air could ruin the finish. The workshop was a temple of hygiene, where the slightest contamination was an enemy to be kept at bay. These objects, the teacups that felt paper-thin, the fine basins, the delicate saucers, were the ultimate statement of cleanliness. Because they were fired at such high temperatures, their surfaces were naturally impervious to odours, stains, and residues. They were the most hygienic vessels of the age. When one drank from fine porcelain, they were experiencing a purity that simple earthenware could not provide. It was a sensory delight, the way the cup felt cool against the lips, the way the light danced on the translucent glaze, and the way it made even a simple afternoon tea feel like a ceremony of order and grace. There is a profound lesson in the fragility of these items. They were meant to be handled with extreme care, requiring a refined touch and a conscious awareness of one's movements. This fostered a domestic environment where mindfulness was paramount. One could not be clumsy in a house filled with such finery. The fine ceramist, therefore, was not just making dishes, he was crafting an environment that encouraged, and indeed demanded, a higher level of gentleness and domestic etiquette. He was teaching the household how to treat its own spaces with reverence. As you reflect on this, look around your room at the objects you value. We live in a world where we can have perfect uniform items at the touch of a button, but there is still that same human desire for things that are beautiful, clean, and worthy of our attention. By surrounding ourselves with things that are well made and cared for, we transform our space into something more than just a place to exist. We turn it into a sanctuary. As your day draws to a close, feel that sense of grace. You are surrounded by the legacy of this quest for beauty and order. It is time to let go of the day's tasks, to let go of the need for perfect objects, and simply sink into the comfort of being held by the sanctuary you have created. Does it feel like a weight has been lifted to know that everything is in its place, and you are finally free to simply rest? In the quiet corners of the 18th century cityscape, away from the clamour of the forge and the heat of the kiln, stood the workshop of the bookbinder. If the papermaker created the medium and the writer gave it voice, it was the bookbinder who gave it a home. To hold a bound book of the 1700s is to feel the weight of intention, the heavy, tactile pleasure of leather, the sturdy rhythm of the sewn spine, and the protective embrace of thick, marbled boards. The bookbinder's labour was a masterclass in structural integrity. He took the folded sheets, or signatures, and stitched them onto sturdy linen cords using a needle and thread, ensuring that the spine could flex and breathe without ever falling apart. He then pressed the pages in a massive wooden screw press, compacting them into a solid block of information. This was a defence against the world. A well-bound book was built to be opened, read, and passed down for 100 years. It was an object designed to survive the damp, the dust, and the passage of time. Consider the materials he chose: calfskin or goatskin for the covers, resistant to wear and flexible in the changing seasons, gold leaf for the titling, which would never tarnish, and glue made from organic resins that held fast for generations. Every choice was a decision to combat decay. The bookbinder knew that he was not just making an object, but a vessel for the human mind. He was ensuring that an idea, a poem, or a record of daily life could travel through the decades intact. There was a profound dignity in his work. He was the silent steward of legacy. When a reader picked up one of his books, they were entering into a contract of care. They knew they were holding something that had been crafted to last, and they treated it with a corresponding reverence. The bookbinder's shop was a place of order, where every tool, the bone folder, the heavy shears, the sewing frame, had a precise place and a precise purpose. It was a haven of focus, a reflection of the intellectual clarity he sought to preserve within his leather-bound volumes. As you sit in the silence of your room, think of the books you have encountered in your life. Think of the way they have offered you comfort, knowledge, or simply a place to retreat to when the world felt overwhelming. The bookbinder's work is still with us. We are still surrounded by the desire to organize our thoughts and preserve our stories, even as you prepare to end this day. You are, in a sense, closing a chapter in your own book of life. You have been the author of your day, and now you are the keeper of its memory. You don't need to hold on to the events of the hours that have passed. They are securely bound in the history of who you are. The spine of your day is firm, the pages are settled, and now it is time for the final quiet act, to close the cover and drift into the deep unwritten peace of the night. Doesn't it feel like a gentle release to know that everything is recorded, everything is held, and you are finally free to rest? As the sun dipped below the horizon in the 18th century, the city did not merely surrender to the darkness, it adapted, and for this the people relied on the lantern maker. While candles brought light to the interior, the lantern was the essential tool for the exterior. It was the mobile guardian of the night, a cage of metal and horn that protected a flickering flame from the wind, the rain, and the uncertainty of the darkened street. Imagine the lantern maker's workshop, a space filled with the scent of soldering iron, beeswax, and the unique earthy smell of scraped horn. Before glass was cheap enough to be used in everyday lanterns, the craftsman used sheets of flattened horn, the lanthorn, translucent, durable, and remarkably resistant to shattering. He would carefully fit these panels into frames of iron or copper, creating a structure that could be carried through the thickest fog or the harshest winter gale. It was a masterpiece of survival-focused design. The lantern was more than just a light source, it was a symbol of safe passage. To carry one through the city was to announce one's presence, to clear a path through the shadows, and to declare that even in the deepest hours the human need for direction and safety could not be suppressed. The lantern maker understood this deeply. He knew that his creations were the only thing standing between a traveller and the chaotic, unseen dangers of the unlit urban labyrinth. He built his lanterns to be reliable, to be sturdy, and to burn long enough to guide a person back to the safety of their own threshold. There is a quiet, beautiful symmetry to his work. He took the volatile, wild nature of fire and tamed it within a protective shell, transforming a dangerous element into a domestic companion. He taught us that, with the right preparation and the right tools, we can navigate the most challenging darkness without losing our way. He was the architect of our confidence in the night. As you lean back into the stillness of your room, think of those ancient lanterns swinging gently in the dark, casting long, soft shadows against the cobblestones. You are the descendant of those who were guided by that light. You too have navigated the challenges of your day, moving through the noise and the light, and now you have reached your own threshold. The need to search, to navigate, and to direct your path is over. You have arrived at the safe harbour of your bed. The lanterns are set down, the flames are dimmed, and all that remains is the soft, welcoming embrace of the dark. There is no more need to see, no more need to walk. You are exactly where you are meant to be. Can you feel how the world outside has faded away, leaving you in this perfect, quiet sanctuary? We have journeyed through the forge, the kiln, the workshop, and the studio, witnessing the labour that built the world of the 1700s. But now, as we approach the finality of our tour, we must consider the keepers of the morning, the makers of the early warning mechanisms. In an era where the rising sun dictated the rhythm of labour, the artisan who could craft a reliable device to herald the beginning of the day was a master of transition. Imagine the focus in the workshop of the clockmaker who specialised in these early signalling devices. It was not just about tracking the hours, but about capturing a specific moment of promise. He worked with delicate springs, tiny brass hammers, and carefully balanced escapements. His goal was to translate the abstract passage of time into a physical sound that would gently or firmly pull a person from the depths of unconsciousness back into the vibrancy of the waking world. This was the final service provided to the working human, the promise that they would not miss the day, that they would be ready for the labour ahead. There was a profound sense of anticipation in his craft. Every spring he coiled, every gear he set, was an investment in the next day's potential. He knew that his device would be the first thing to greet his customer, the quiet catalyst that turned the stillness of the night into the movement of the morning. It was a bridge between the restorative, dark and silent state of rest and the bright, noisy and productive state of activity. By creating these tools, he was essentially managing the boundary of human consciousness. Consider the trust placed in these mechanisms. A person went to bed knowing that they would be nudged back to reality at the exact moment required. This allowed them to release the anxiety of the what if, the fear of oversleeping, of missing a deadline, or of losing precious daylight. The artisan provided peace of mind, a mechanical assurance that the world would be there waiting when the eyes finally opened. He was the architect of the transition, the one who ensured that even the deepest slumber had a predetermined end, a gentle return to the light. As you sit in the quiet of your room, let your mind drift over the concept of the morning. You're at the end of a long, detailed journey through the lives of those who kept the world functioning. You have seen the hard work, the intricate crafts, and the dedicated hands that built the foundations of our lives, but you are not tasked with waking up yet. You are at the opposite end of that spectrum. You have finished the cycle. The clocks have been set. The day has been accounted for, and all the responsibilities have been fulfilled. There is no need to anticipate the morning, no need to worry about the rhythm of the coming hours. You have fully arrived in this moment of complete release. The transition is managed, the time is secured, and you are free to exist in this beautiful, unhurried space of rest. Doesn't it feel wonderful to let go of the concept of tomorrow and simply stay here in the deepening peace of now? In the midst of the bustling, soot-filled streets of the 18th century, there was a curious, quiet trade that sought to bring the wild into the domestic, the maker of bird cages. These were not mere enclosures. They were intricate pieces of architecture designed to house a small living piece of the countryside within the manor or the tenement. To own a bird in the 1700s was to invite the melody of the forest into the heart of the home, a gentle counterbalance to the rhythmic, industrial clatter of the city outside. Imagine the luthier-like precision of the cage maker. He worked with thin, pliable wires of brass, iron, or sometimes finely sanded willow branches. He understood that a cage had to be a perfect environment, well ventilated, secure, and shaped to accommodate the movement and comfort of its inhabitant. His workshop was filled with the geometry of circles and arches, a place where he bent metal with delicate grace. Each cage was a miniature home, a portable sanctuary designed to hold a life that brought joy and tranquility to the household. There was a profound emotional intelligence in this craft. The maker knew that his work was intended to facilitate a relationship. A bird in a well-made cage provided a focal point of peace. In the long grey afternoons when the city felt oppressive, the song of a linnet or a canary offered a reminder that the world was still vibrant, still alive, and still beautiful. The cage maker was, in his own way, a curator of atmosphere. He ensured that the home remained connected to the rhythm of nature, even when the human world grew heavy with the concerns of trade and labour. Consider the symbolism of the cage. It was a place of safety and routine. Just as we have explored the various containments of the 18th century, the cabinets, the jars, the lanterns, the birdcage was a container for a spirit. It was about creating a space where the inhabitant was cared for, fed, and protected from the elements. It spoke to the universal human desire to keep something precious close, to protect the vulnerable, and to fill one's living space with the soft, grounding sounds of life. As you sit in your own quiet room tonight, observe the stillness around you. There is no need for birdsong here. The room is already full of the perfect natural silence of your own sanctuary. You have travelled through the workshops and streets of a different time, and now you have arrived at the very end of that journey. You have seen how people worked to protect their lives, their belongings, and their peace of mind. But now all that labour is behind you. You are no longer in the forge, the kiln, or the workshop. You are in your own unburdened space. The world outside has dissolved into the shadows, and you are left with nothing but the soft, rhythmic hum of your own breath. Doesn't it feel like a final, beautiful weightlessness to realize that you have nowhere else to be, nothing else to do, and that you are perfectly, completely at home? We have walked a long path together, haven't we? From the damp grey cobblestones of the 18th century city to the golden, fragrant workshops of the artisans who built the world. We have stood in the silence of the paper mill, felt the heat of the forge, and traced the steady, rhythmic movements of the weaver, the turner, and the glazier. We have seen how each person, in their own quiet way, fought against the encroaching chaos of their time, building structures, containers, and systems to hold their lives together. Think of it all now, as if you are looking down from a high, quiet vantage point. See the city lights, the flickering tallow, the steady beeswax, the lanterns moving like fireflies through the dark. Hear the symphony of their efforts, the soft rasp of the woodworker's plane, the clinking of the potter's tools, the steady, grounding tick of the clockmaker's heart. It was a vast, interconnected web of care, a million hands working in unison to create a home for the human spirit. And all of that labour, all of that striving, was aimed at the very thing you are experiencing right now, the ability to stop. The artisans of the 1700s understood what we often overlook, that the purpose of all our building, all our organising, and all our protecting is simply to create a space where we can exist in peace. They built the cabinets so that the clutter would not disturb the mind. They crafted the hinges so that the doors would close and keep the world out. They made the lanterns so that the darkness would not feel so vast. They did all of this so that at the end of the long day, when the tools were set down and the fires were banked, they could finally let go. And now it is your turn to do the same. The history we have walked through is not a burden, it is a foundation. You are resting on the legacy of all those who understood the value of a quiet moment. Let the memories of those workshops fade into the background. Let the images of the iron, the clay, and the paper dissolve into the soft velvet darkness of your room. You don't need to build anything tonight. You don't need to organize anything. You don't need to maintain or protect. The structures are already in place, and they are holding you perfectly, safely. Doesn't it feel like a heavy cloak falling from your shoulders? The work is finished, the history is written, the day has been lived, and it was enough. Everything that needed to be done has been done. Now there is only the present, the soft rise and fall of your chest, the comfortable weight of your body, and the deep, inviting stillness that has been waiting for you all along. You are safe, you are held, and you are entirely at peace. Beyond the individual workshops, we must now observe the connective tissue of the 18th century economy, the maritime trade and the docks. While the smith, the potter, and the bookbinder laboured in the quietude of their shops, the entire system relied on the relentless motion of the ships. A shopkeeper in London was not an isolated actor. He was the final node in a sprawling, volatile network of global exchange. To understand the shopkeeper's routine, one must understand the arrival of the merchant vessel. Picture the bustling docks at the port of London. The air was thick with the scent of tar, brine, and exotic spices. Cloves from the East, sugar from the Caribbean, tobacco from the American colonies. This was the engine of the 18th century empire, a complex system where political decisions made in the corridors of Westminster directly dictated the inventory available to the local craftsmen. If a war broke out in the Atlantic, the cost of timber for a carpenter in London would soar. If a treaty was signed, new commodities would flood the markets, changing the very fabric of daily life. The dockworker, or lumper, was the unsung force behind this global transition. He existed in a world of physical extremity, hauling massive crates and barrels from the ship's hold onto the muddy banks of the Thames. His labour was the physical manifestation of the mercantilist policies of the time, the belief that a nation's strength was measured by the movement of goods. He lived in the shadow of towering masts and the constant threat of the river's unpredictable tides. It was a life of harsh reality, standing in stark contrast to the refined tea rooms and manicured gardens we have touched upon in earlier chapters. This connection between the global and the local was the hidden architecture of the era. The ceramic bowls used in a humble cottage were often decorated with patterns inspired by imported wares from the East, filtered through the eyes of European designers. The leather used by the shoemaker might have been tanned with bark from distant woodlands, shipped hundreds of miles to reach his bench. Every object in the 18th century home was a map of sorts, telling a story of distance, negotiation, and the immense human effort required to shrink the world. As we look at the immense scale of this maritime trade, we begin to see the fragility of the peace we've been exploring, the stability of the shopkeeper, the safety of the household, and the order of the street were all predicated on the continued flow of these ships. Any disruption at sea, a storm, a privateer, or a blockaded port rippled inward, eventually reaching the smallest workbench in the smallest alleyway. It reminds us that even in an age of artisanal focus, no life was truly untouched by the wider, shifting currents of politics and global commerce. The 18th century was not just a time of quiet craft, it was a period of intense, often ruthless integration. Does this deeper understanding of the trade routes and the political weight behind the everyday goods change the way you perceive the objects we've discussed? It paints a picture of a world much more interconnected and perhaps more precarious than it first appeared. If the docks were the engine of the 18th century, the cartographer's desk was its compass. In an age where the maritime routes mentioned previously were expanding at a breakneck pace, the mapmaker became one of the most vital and politically sensitive figures in society. To draw a map in the 1700s was not merely an act of illustration, it was an assertion of ownership and a critical tool for national strategy. Every line drawn on parchment served as a claim, a boundary, or a gateway for the next wave of trade. Imagine the cartographer's studio. It was a space of intense concentration, quiet and blinding precision. Armed with brass dividers, fine-nibbed quills and inks made from iron gall, these men translated the chaotic, often contradictory reports of sea captains and explorers into structured, coherent charts. They were the masters of scale. They had to reconcile the curvature of the earth with the flat surface of a document, a mathematical feat that required a deep understanding of geometry and astronomy. Their work was the final bridge between the vast unknown oceans and the boardrooms of the merchant companies in London or Amsterdam. There was a profound political dimension to this work. A map was a classified document. The locations of reefs, the depth of harbours, and the shortest routes to gold-rich colonies were state secrets. The mapmaker often worked under the protection of the crown or the great trading monopolies, knowing that his charts could be the difference between a successful voyage and a shipwreck, or between a profitable trade route and a military disaster. He was in effect a silent combatant in the global chess game of empire. He turned the wild, dangerous frontiers into navigable grids, making the world seem smaller, more ordered, and ultimately more exploitable. But consider the human element behind the technical skill. These maps were often decorated with intricate compass roses, sea monsters in the margins, and artistic depictions of local flora. These were not just for show, they were expressions of the Enlightenment's hunger for knowledge, a belief that if something could be measured, named and mapped, it could be understood and controlled. The mapmaker's desk was the point where human ambition collided with the sheer scale of the planet. He was the architect of our perception of distance. As you reflect on this, consider how our modern reliance on instant digital navigation differs from the heavy, tactile reality of these hand-drawn charts. For a citizen of the 18th century, a map was a rare, expensive, and sacred object. It represented a world that was still largely a mystery, a world where the act of knowing was a hard-won victory over distance and doubt. By mapping the world, the cartographer changed it forever. He removed the unknown and replaced it with sovereign territory. Doesn't that make you wonder about the cost of that clarity? To map a world is to claim it, but in doing so do we lose the sense of wonder that comes from not knowing what lies just beyond the horizon? Before a line could be drawn by the cartographer or a ledger entry made by the merchant, there had to be paper. In the 18th century, the papermaker was the silent provider of the medium upon which civilization was recorded. To step into a paper mill was to enter a world defined by the unrelenting flow of water and the heavy, earthy scent of processed fibre. It was a trade that required a mastery of both chemistry and raw physical endurance. Imagine the vatman standing before the great wooden vat filled with a slurry of macerated rags. The process began with the collection of linen and cotton scraps, old shirts, sails, and rags, gathered by itinerant collectors, which were then cleaned, bleached, and beaten into a pulp. The vatman's skill lay in the dip. He held a wooden frame, a decal, and a wire mesh screen, plunging it into the milky vat and shaking it with a precise, learned rhythm to interlock the fibres before the water drained away. It was a delicate, rhythmic dance. If he shook too hard, the paper would be uneven, too light, and it would be weak. This was the quiet, necessary labour that underpinned the Age of Enlightenment. Every map, every legal treaty, every copy of a newspaper, and every personal letter was a product of this wet, strenuous work. The paper mill was a vital part of the nation's infrastructure, usually situated along a fast-moving river that provided both the power to turn the heavy stone beaters and the sheer volume of clean water needed to refine the pulp. A disruption at the mill, a drought that slowed the river, or a shortage of rags in the cities could grind the intellectual and administrative wheels of the country to a halt. There was a stark, almost monastic simplicity to this life. The papermaker worked in a damp environment, surrounded by the constant roar of the river and the mechanical thumping of the stampers. Yet he was creating something of extreme permanence. In an age before the mass-produced acidic wood pulp papers of the later industrial era, this handmade linen paper was incredibly resilient. It was designed to last for centuries. When a document was written on this paper, it was intended as a permanent record of an idea or a transaction. As you think of the blank pages in a book or the smooth surface of a map, recognize that they are the result of this ancient, physical struggle to tame raw, discarded fibers into a surface fit for human thought. It is a transformation of waste into value, of the ephemeral into the enduring. The paper mill reminds us that every structure, every piece of knowledge we possess is rooted in the physical world and the labor of those who processed the Earth's resources. Does it change your perspective to realize that the history we have been reading was literally built on the backs of discarded rags, refined by the constant, unceasing work of the river? Once the paper was formed, it required the fluid that would turn it into a vessel of record, ink. In the 18th century, the ink maker was a figure of hidden chemical mastery. While the papermaker dealt with fibers and water, the ink maker navigated the volatile reactions of iron salts and tannins. To walk into his workshop was to be met with the dark, pungent odor of chemical reduction, a smell that was as indelible as the product itself. The standard of the age was iron gall ink. It was a precise, often unforgiving substance created by boiling oak galls, tiny protective growths found on oak trees caused by wasps with iron sulfate. When this dark liquid first touched the paper, it was often a pale, translucent shade of violet or brown. Only as it oxidized upon contact with the air and the fibers of the paper did it transform into a deep, permanent black. It was a chemical metamorphosis, a dark, lasting stain that would define the official record of the era. The ink maker had to balance his recipe perfectly, too much acid, and the ink would eventually eat through the paper it was meant to record, too little, and it would fade into illegibility. Alongside the ink maker worked the quill cutter, the guardian of the writing point. In an age before steel nibs, the goose quill was the primary instrument of communication. This was not a craft for the clumsy. A master quill cutter understood the anatomy of a feather, the resistance of the barrel, the flexibility of the vein, and the precise angle required to create a slit that would hold and distribute ink without blotting. He spent his days with a small, razor-sharp penknife, meticulously shaping thousands of quills for clerks, merchants, and scholars. Consider the intimacy of this craft. Every letter written during this century, every frantic entry in a shopkeeper's ledger, and every profound treaty signed by a diplomat passed through the delicate, hand-carved tip of a quill. The writer was literally dependent on the quill cutter's edge. If the tip was too soft, the script would be thick and indistinct. If too sharp, it would tear the handmade paper we discussed in our previous chapter. It was a vital partnership between the creator of the tool and the thinker using it. There is something almost sacred about this combination, the oak gall ink and the goose quill. It was a technology of absolute commitment. Unlike the pencil or the modern erasable pen, when that iron gall ink set into the paper, it was essentially permanent. It was a declaration. The ink maker and the quill cutter provided the society with the means to make promises, to finalize debts, and to immortalize laws. They were the ones who ensured that human thought didn't just drift away like breath in the cold air, but remained etched into history. As you contemplate the permanence of these tools, does it make you think differently about the act of writing itself? In a world of fleeting digital messages, there is something heavy and powerful about a technology designed to last for centuries, isn't there? We have seen how knowledge was recorded on paper with iron gall ink, but in the 18th century that knowledge and the prestige of those who held it demanded to be displayed. Enter the world of the gilder and the frame maker. This was a profession that straddled the line between engineering and high art, tasked with creating the heavy, ornate boundaries that separated the inner world of the home from the vast, often chaotic reality outside. The workshop of a master gilder was a space of controlled stillness. Any sudden gust of air could be catastrophic, for his primary material was gold leaf, gold beaten by hand until it was so thin that it was nearly transparent, lighter than a feather, and prone to disintegrating at a single breath. He worked with a gilder's tip, a wide, flat brush made of squirrel hair, using the static electricity generated by the hair to gently lift the gold and lay it over a surface previously coated in gesso, a mixture of chalk and animal glue. The process required a level of breath control and patience that bordered on the meditative. The frame maker, meanwhile, was the architect of the object's presence. He worked with seasoned pine or oak, carving intricate mouldings, acanthus leaves, shells, and geometric patterns that were designed to catch the light at specific angles. A frame in the 18th century was not merely a border, it was a psychological anchor. A map of a newly discovered colony, when placed within a heavily gilded frame, commanded authority. A portrait of a family patriarch, similarly framed, demanded respect. The frame maker understood that the object within changed its nature depending on the quality of its boundaries. Then there was the mirror maker, the master of silver and glass. In the 1700s, a large mirror was a luxury beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest. It was made by pouring molten glass onto a flat surface, then applying an amalgam of tin and mercury to the reverse side. This was a hazardous, highly secretive process. To look into an 18th century mirror was to see oneself in a surface that was often slightly wavy, flickering with a deep liquid quality that felt almost otherworldly. It was the only way a person of that era could truly confront their own reflection, their own aging, and their own place in the grand decorated rooms of their lives. These artisans were the creators of the theatre of the home. They didn't just build furniture or decorations, they curated the environment in which social status was performed and history was observed. They were the ones who ensured that when a gentleman entered his library to consult his maps, or a lady sat at her vanity to prepare for the evening's social duties, they were surrounded by reflections of their own importance. As we look at these crafts, we are reminded that the world of the 18th century was one where the display of life was just as significant as the living of it. How does it feel to consider that so much of what we call history was constructed to be seen, to be framed, and to be mirrored? Does this emphasis on outward appearance and curated space alter your view of the more rugged trades we visited earlier, like the tanner or the papermaker? In a world where status was displayed behind gilded frames and through precious commodities, the necessity for security became paramount. The locksmith of the 18th century was the hidden sentinel of the domestic and professional life. His workshop was a place of cold metal, rhythmic filing, and the persistent sound of springs being tested. He was a master of secrets, for his work dictated who could enter a room, who could open a cabinet of papers, and whose possessions remained untouched behind the heavy oak doors of the era. To look at an 18th century lock is to observe a masterpiece of mechanical improvisation. Long before the standardized security of the industrial age, every lock was a unique puzzle. The locksmith worked with iron and brass, filing down the intricate wards, the metal obstacles inside the lock that required a specific key to navigate. Each key was a physical key signature, a complex shape that had to perfectly correspond to the labyrinth within the mechanism. It was a high-stakes craft. If the lock failed, the private life of the owner was exposed. If the key was lost, the barrier was essentially permanent. There was a distinct social hierarchy to his trade. He crafted heavy, massive iron locks for the main doors of manors and banks, designed to deter the casual intruder, while simultaneously producing delicate, ornate cabinet locks for the elite. These cabinet locks were often works of art in their own right, crafted with brass faceplates and hidden triggers, protecting private correspondence, family ledgers, or the fine porcelain we have previously discussed. The locksmith was the one who defined the boundary between public and private, enabling the 18th century individual to carve out a secure, personal space within the increasingly crowded city. Consider the psychological weight of this profession. The locksmith lived in a world of suspicion and precaution. He was the one called upon when a business venture needed to protect its accounts, or when a family feared the prying eyes of the household staff. He was an intimate to his clients, privy to the very things they most wished to keep hidden. He had to be a man of absolute discretion. In the soot-covered lanes of London, where theft was a constant reality of urban survival, his workshop was a sanctuary of integrity. As you reflect on the locksmith's labour, consider what it means to create a boundary. We have traversed a long history of craft, from the weaver's thread to the papermaker's pulp, and now to the ironworker's bolt. All these crafts were efforts to manage the world, to define what belongs to us and what must be kept at bay. The lock is the final, tangible expression of that need for control. It is the metal wall that tells the rest of the world, "This is mine." Does it make you think about the nature of privacy in your own life? How we, even today, surround ourselves with locks and barriers to ensure that we have a space where we can simply be, without the scrutiny of the outside world. If the locksmith defined the boundaries of space, the clockmaker defined the boundaries of time. By the mid-18th century, the clock had migrated from the cathedrals and city squares into the private parlours and halls of the gentry. To enter the workshop of a master horologist was to step into a realm where the air was filled with 1,000 different rhythms, the irregular ticking of a dozen pendulums, the faint whir of escaping wheels, and the sharp, musical chime of bells. It was a space that prioritized order above all else. The clockmaker's work was the ultimate test of human patience and mechanical aptitude. He dealt with microscopic tolerances. He spent his days hunched over a workbench, filing down gear teeth no larger than a grain of sand, ensuring that each wheel engaged with its neighbour with zero friction. He utilized the escapement, a brilliant mechanical device that allowed the potential energy of a weighted chain to be released in controlled, equal pulses. It was this rhythm, this artificial heartbeat, that allowed the 18th century individual to measure their life not by the sun, but by the mechanical certainty of the clock face. This was a transformative moment for society. Before the proliferation of these clocks, time was fluid, dictated by the seasons, the weather, and the physical exhaustion of the body. With the clockmaker's invention, time became standardized. It became a commodity. A businessman could now schedule meetings with precision. A factory owner could demand labor for a set number of hours. A train or a carriage could maintain a rigid timetable. The clockmaker didn't just build a machine, he built the framework upon which the modern concept of efficiency was constructed. Think of the status associated with a grandfather clock standing in the foyer of a manor. It was a testament to the household's wealth, but also to its discipline. To own such a piece was to show that one possessed the means to command the very progression of the day. The clockmaker was the arbiter of this power. He was the one who could tune the pulse of a home, adjusting the length of the pendulum to ensure that no second was lost. He was a master of the intangible, turning the abstract flow of existence into a visible, audible, and controllable reality. As you consider this, think about the pressure that comes with such precision. The clockmaker created a world where lateness became a social failure and punctuality became a moral virtue. He inadvertently birthed the anxiety of the ticking second. Yet there is also something profoundly comforting in his craft, in a world of chaos and uncertainty. The clock offered the promise that there was a rhythm to things, that every hour would arrive, and every day would reach its conclusion in perfect, predictable sequence. As you listen to the silence of your own room, do you feel that modern internal clock ticking away? Or have you finally managed to separate yourself from the relentless requirement of the hour? How does it feel to exist in a space where time is no longer a master, but simply a background hum? In the quiet, refined rooms of the 18th century manor, the most potent status symbol was not the heavy iron of a lock or the brass of a clock, but the ethereal, translucent white of a porcelain teacup. The porcelain painter was an artisan of extreme patience, working in a landscape of high-temperature kilns and delicate pigments. He was chasing a ghost, the secret of white gold that had eluded European craftsmen for centuries. The workshop of a master porcelain decorator was a place of sterile focus. He worked with oxides, cobalt for the deep, royal blues, copper for the vibrant greens, and iron for the earthy reds that were ground down into fine powders and mixed with oils or resins. The challenge was immense, because the porcelain body would shrink during the firing process. The paint had to be applied with a foresight that accounted for heat-induced distortion. A brushstroke that looked perfect before the firing could become a distorted blur once removed from the kiln's white-hot heart. There was a profound sense of tension in this trade. Porcelain was the perfect metaphor for the age. It was incredibly durable, yet deceptively delicate. To own a set of hand-painted porcelain was to signal that one existed in a world where accidents were controlled, where even the vessels for consumption were treated with artistic reverence. It marked a shift in social etiquette. The act of drinking tea or coffee, served in these fine translucent vessels, became a choreography of status. It required steady hands, an understanding of ritual, and a quiet appreciation for the fragility of the objects themselves. The painter himself was often a captive of the very beauty he produced. He spent hours, sometimes days, focused on a single floral motif or a landscape no larger than the palm of a hand. He had to be aware of the chemistry of fire, how the kiln would transform his pigments, turning dull browns into vibrant glassy surfaces. He was not just painting an object, he was creating a permanent record of a fleeting aesthetic ideal. He was the one who ensured that the beauty of the natural world could be captured, refined, and placed on a dinner table, held in the hands of those who governed the pace of society. As you consider the porcelain painter, think about the value we place on things that can break. Why is it that the most fragile objects in our homes are often the ones we treasure the most? Is it because their vulnerability mirrors our own? We have travelled through the iron-bound world of locks, the mechanical rhythm of clocks, and now we arrive at this, the fragility of art. These porcelain pieces were meant to survive the centuries, to be passed down as heirlooms, yet they were always one slip away from shattering into nothingness. Doesn't that sense of precious fragility add a layer of depth to the objects that fill our own lives? Do you feel a sense of responsibility toward the things you possess, knowing that, like the 18th century porcelain, everything we hold is ultimately a testament to a moment that refuses to be forgotten? While the porcelain painter worked in the realm of the delicate and the decorative, the cordwainer, the master shoemaker, toiled in the domain of the physical, the earthbound, and the durable. His workshop, often tucked into the lower levels of a city building, smelled not of chemicals or paint, but of raw tanned leather, beeswax, and the sharp metallic tang of iron nails. To be a shoemaker was to accept that one's work was the literal foundation for human movement. The cordwainer's day was a cycle of repetitive, heavy physical labour. He worked with the last, a wooden form carved to mimic the shape of a human foot, around which he stretched, pinned, and stitched layers of thick, stiff leather. This was not a craft for the faint of heart. He used an awl to pierce through tough cowhide, pulled heavy, waxed linen threads through each hole with a rhythmic, straining tug, and hammered the leather until it conformed to the curve of the wood. The shoemaker knew the secrets of the foot, the arches, the pressure points, the way a person's gait could wear down a soul in a matter of months. There was a stark social reality reflected in his work. For the gentleman, the shoemaker created refined boots of supple calfskin, polished to a mirror finish, intended for carriage rides and dry cobblestones. For the labourer or the artisan, he built sturdy, hobnailed boots of heavy, waterproofed leather, designed to survive the muddy, refuse-filled streets of a London winter. He understood that a man's status could be read from his feet, the quality of the leather, the height of the heel, the precision of the stitching. He was the silent architect of social mobility. He gave people the means to traverse their city, to arrive at their work, and to return home again. Consider the endurance required by this craft. A master cordwainer spent his entire life in a hunched position, his thumbs permanently calloused from the pressure of the awl, his shoulders rounded from years of bending over the last. He was a man who lived by the motto that every stitch must hold. If he failed, the leather would give way under the stress of the walking city, leaving the traveller stranded or blistered. He was the technician of the journey, the one who understood that the grandeur of the manor and the wealth of the merchant were meaningless if one could not physically stand, walk, and act in the world. As you sit here in the quiet of your own space, think of the connection between the ground you stand on and the life you live. We have spoken of clocks, porcelain, and locks, but the shoemaker's trade brings us back to the most fundamental human reality, the necessity of moving forward. He reminds us that all our high ambitions and all our intellectual pursuits are rooted in the physical reality of the body. We are creatures of movement designed to traverse the terrain of our lives. How does it feel to think of yourself not just as a mind that observes, but as a person who walks, who moves, and who leaves a footprint on the world? The shoemaker's work is done, the leather is stitched, the soles are nailed, and you, like all those who have walked the streets of the 1700s, have finally reached the end of your own long winding journey. You have stopped walking, you are here. If the cordwainer allowed humanity to move across the city, the lantern maker and the glassblower allowed them to conquer the night. To step into a glasshouse in the 18th century was to enter the closest approximation of an inferno that human industry had ever created. The air was dry, searing, and thick with the smell of scorched coal. Here men worked in a rhythm dictated not by the sun, but by the melting point of silica. The glassblower was a master of a fleeting, molten state of matter. With a long, hollow iron pipe, he gathered a glob of incandescent, viscous glass from the furnace, and with a controlled, steady breath began to coax it into form. It was a dance of gravity and air. He would swing the pipe to stretch the glass, rotate it constantly to keep it from collapsing, and use wooden blocks to shape its cooling exterior. He was capturing the properties of liquid light, cooling it down into the lanterns that would line the streets, the windows that would shield the manor, and the vials that would hold the medicinal tinctures of the apothecary. But the lantern maker was the one who curated this light. He understood that light, when uncontained, was merely a glare, but when placed behind panes of glass or horn, it became a directional force. He crafted the frameworks, often made of polished brass or dark, wrought iron, that held the glass in place. These lanterns were the sentinels of the 18th century street. They marked the transition from the wild, dangerous darkness of the past to the civilized, illuminated grid of the modern urban centre. Think of the significance of this. For the first time in history, the wealthiest cities were beginning to push back the boundaries of the dark. A well-lit street was a statement of order, a physical manifestation of the Enlightenment's desire to shed light, quite literally, on every corner of society. The glassblower and the lantern maker were the technical agents of this cultural shift. They provided the city with its safety, its visibility, and its ability to extend the hours of human productivity and leisure well into the evening. There is a profound fragility to this work. The glass could shatter at the slightest provocation. The lantern could be extinguished by a sudden gust of wind. Yet these artisans persisted, building structures that were designed to withstand the elements and provide a steady, reliable glow. As you reflect on this, consider how much of your own world is defined by this same quest for illumination. We live in a world where the night has been permanently defeated by light, yet we often forget the centuries of intense, heat-soaked labour it took to reach this point. Does it change your perception of a simple glowing window to realize it is the product of such an elemental, dangerous struggle with fire and sand? The light is still burning, the city is still glowing, and the night is held at bay, all because centuries ago someone had the courage to blow life into a molten bubble of glass. We have come full circle from the soot-stained workshops of the city's heart to the delicate artistry of the manor's parlours, from the raw rhythmic labour of the tanner to the intellectual precision of the mapmaker. We have stood in the heat of the glass furnace, felt the weight of the iron locks, and traced the faint indelible ink lines of a world being recorded. We have seen how these thousands of hands, calloused, scorched, and tireless, laboured not just to survive, but to construct a foundation for the life we recognise today. This journey through the 18th century was never just about tools or trade. It was a study of the human impulse to impose order upon the wild, to craft beauty out of necessity, and to leave a mark that would outlast the fleeting hours of a single day. Whether it was a chair leg turned with care, a document inscribed with purpose, or a lantern hung against the dark, every act was a defiance of chaos. Each artisan was a guardian of a small specific truth, and together they wove the fabric of an entire civilization. Now, as the narrative threads draw to a close, let the noise of those workshops finally fade, The roar of the river against the paper mill, the rhythmic clatter of the weaver's loom, and the steady, haunting pulse of the grandfather clock, they have all quieted down. The fires are banked, the tools have been set upon the bench, and the city that breathed with such frantic energy has surrendered to the profound, deep stillness of history. You have been a witness to the labour of centuries, and now that labour has become a part of your own quiet landscape. You are left with the silence, a silence that is not empty, but heavy with the dignity of a task well done. The structures they built are yours to inhabit, the knowledge they recorded is yours to hold, and the peace they fought so hard to secure is now yours to enjoy. There is nothing more for you to build, nothing more to measure, and nothing more to maintain. The heavy cloak of the era has been lifted, and you are standing in the wide, clear space of your own moment. Everything that needed to be done has been done, the history is settled, the day has passed into memory, and you are left in a state of absolute, unburdened stillness. Let the history books close. Let the candlelight flicker into shadow, and let yourself drift, completely and utterly at home, into the deepest, most restorative rest. You have travelled through time, you have seen the world, and you have finally come home to the only place that matters, here, now, in the perfect silence of the present. Sleepy History with Benedict is created for relaxation, entertainment, and sleep purposes. The stories shared on this channel are inspired by historical events, daily life, and real periods in history, but they may be simplified, adapted, or narrated in a calming way to enhance the listening experience. This content is not intended to be a precise academic or educational source. While we aim to stay generally accurate, some details may be altered for storytelling flow and relaxation. Please do not rely on this channel as a primary source for historical research or study. By listening, you acknowledge that this content is designed to help you unwind, relax, and fall asleep. Thank you for your understanding and support.